Welcome back to the quiet apothecary. Take a slow breath, let your shoulders drop, and settle into wherever you happen to be resting tonight. There is nothing here that asks anything of you, and nowhere at all you need to be. Tonight we do not climb the stair to the stillroom, with its cool shelves and its rows of stoppered glass. We do not cross the yard to the apothecary shop, where the labelled jars stand in their patient ranks and the scales wait on the counter. We stay instead in the warmest room in the whole house, the one every other room is arranged around, the kitchen. For the truth of it is that long before there were physicians within a day's walk, and long before most families could ever have paid one, the kitchen was already the pharmacy of the ordinary home. The same low fire that turned the family's supper also warmed its medicine. The same hands that stirred the pot also mixed the poultice. And the goodwife who ruled that hearth was, without ever once calling herself by such a grand word, the first physician the household would ever know. Imagine, if you will, a medieval kitchen at the close of an ordinary day. The light outside has gone from gold to grey to nearly nothing, and the only steady glow left in the world is the low red heart of the hearth. A great blackened pot hangs from its hook above the coals, murmuring to itself. Bunches of dried herbs sway very slightly from the beams overhead, stirred by the warmth rising from the fire. On a shelf against the wall stand a crock of honey, a jug of vinegar, a box of precious salt, and a small locked chest that holds things worth more than their weight in silver. This is where we will spend our night, slow and unhurried, and steady as the pot murmuring over the coals. There is no need to remember any of this. Let your attention come and go exactly as it pleases. We have a great many quiet hours ahead of us, and a great many small things still to look at, and not one of them will mind in the least if you drift off partway through and leave the rest until morning. Let us begin at the fire itself. Everything in the medieval kitchen began and ended at the hearth. In the poorest cottages, this was simply a ring of stones set in the middle of the earthen floor, the smoke finding its own slow way out through a hole in the thatch or through the door left ajar. In grander houses the fire had been moved to a proper stone hearth against the wall, with a chimney to carry the smoke away, and by the later medieval century this was becoming the ordinary arrangement, even in modest homes. But whatever its shape, the fire was the one thing that could never be allowed to fail. It cooked, it warmed, it dried the herbs, it heated the water, and it kept the dark and the damp at bay. A household without a fire was a household in real trouble, and much of the goodwife's day, and a good deal of her skill, went into the quiet, endless task of keeping it alive. We might pause here on the sheer labor of that. Matches, as we know them, lay centuries in the future, and lighting a fire from cold was slow and uncertain work, done with flint and steel, and a scrap of charred linen coaxed into a glow, then fed with the driest tinder a house could keep. Because starting again from nothing was such a trial, the fire was almost never allowed to go fully out. Instead, last thing at night, it was banked. The glowing embers were drawn together into a heap and covered over with ash, so that they smouldered slowly through the small hours without flame, holding their heat until morning, when the ash could be raked back and the coals blown gently into life once more. There is even a common old word buried in this nightly ritual. The curfew from the old French couvre-feu meaning simply cover the fire, was in origin nothing more sinister than the bell that told a town it was time to bank the hearth for the night and lower the risk of a stray spark taking hold while everyone slept. Let us turn now to the warmth itself and why it counted as medicine. To a modern listener, warmth is comfort, but it is not usually thought of as treatment. To the medieval household it was both at once. In an age of draughty walls, damp floors, and long cold winters, simple heat was one of the most reliable remedies anyone possessed. A person who had taken a chill was set close by the fire, wrapped warm, and given something hot to drink, and a surprising number of small illnesses eased under exactly this care. The old understanding of the body, inherited from the physicians of Greece and Rome, and taught in every medical text of the age, held that health was a matter of balance between four qualities: the hot and the cold, the moist and the dry. A body that had grown too cold and too damp from a soaking in the rain or a night spent out of doors was thought to need warming and drying to bring it back into balance. The fire and the warm food and drink prepared over it did exactly that. Whatever we might make of the theory now, the practice of it, resting a shivering person by a good fire with a warm cup in their hands, was sound and gentle care, and it was the kitchen that provided it. We turn now to the pot hook and the trivet, and the small iron company of the fire. Around every working hearth there gathered a little family of iron and steel tools, each with its patient task. From above hung the pot hook, sometimes an adjustable ratcheted bar called a hake or a cottrell, which let the goodwife raise or lower a pot over the flames to give it more heat or less, the difference between a fierce boil and the barest simmer. On the hearthstone itself stood the trivet, a three-legged iron stand on which a pot or a pan could rest close to the coals. There were long-handled skillets and posnets, small-footed pots that stood right among the embers, and the brandreth, an iron grid laid over the fire for broiling. Every one of these was as much a tool of medicine as of cookery, for the very same trivet that held the supper pot in the evening might hold, later that same night, a small pipkin of herbs set gently to steep for a sick child. In the medieval kitchen, there was no line drawn between the pans you cooked with and the pans you healed with. They were the same pans, standing at the same fire. We turn now to the heating of water, which was itself a quiet act of medicine. It is easy to forget, from the comfort of a world where clean hot water arrives at the turn of a tap, how much of the kitchen fire's work was simply the heating of water, and how much healing depended on it. Water set over the coals in a great cauldron or a wide brass pan served 100 purposes through a day, and a good many of them touched on health. Warm water washed a wound clean before it was bound, and washed the linen that dressed it. It made the fomentation, a cloth wrung out in a warm herbal brew and laid steaming against an aching joint or a stiff neck, one of the gentlest and most common comforts the kitchen could offer. It steeped the herbs for a tea or an infusion, drew the virtue from a root in a long slow decoction, and softened bran or bread for a poultice. And the simple boiling of water, though no one of the age understood quite why, made it safer to drink and safer to use, so that the household which took its drink as ale or as herb, steeped warm water, rather than straight from a doubtful well, was quietly spared a great deal of the summer sickness that carried off so many. The fire that heated the water was, in this humble and unnoticed way, one of the surest protectors of the family's health that the house possessed. Let us turn now to the Goodwife herself and her quiet authority over all of it. The kitchen and the fire at its center was the Goodwife's domain almost without question. In a world where a woman held little enough formal power, the household's health, its food, and its stores of remedy were hers to command, and this was no small thing. It was she who decided what went into the pot, she who kept the count of the salt and the spice, she who knew which dried bunch overhead was for the cough and which for the griping in the belly, and she who judged when someone fell ill, whether a warm posset by the fire would answer, or whether the trouble was grave enough to send for costlier help. The old books that survive from the centuries when such knowledge finally came to be written down assume this competence entirely. They are addressed to the housewife as a matter of course, and they take it as given that the ordering of the household's health belongs to her, alongside the brewing, the baking, the dairy, and the care of the young and the old. There is a gentle detail worth holding on to here. The knowledge of this kitchen physic passed, in most households, not through any book at all, but from mother to daughter, hand to hand and word to word, exactly as the tending of the fire itself was taught. A girl learned to bank the embers and to make a warming caudle in the very same years, from the very same person. And to her the two skills were not separate arts. They were simply parts of one whole, the ordinary knowledge of how to keep a house, and the people in it alive and warm through the turning of the year. Let us turn now to the fire at night and the peace of the banked hearth. When the meal was cleared and the tools set by, and the last of the household's tasks were done, the kitchen entered its quietest hour. The pots were scoured and hung, the herbs checked, the fire drawn together and covered for the night. And in that low red glow, with the smoke gone thin and the room finally still, the kitchen became a place of rest as much as of work. Someone unwell was often settled here to sleep, near the banked warmth, rather than in a cold bedchamber, for the fire's slow heat lasted the night and eased the aches that the cold made worse. There is something worth carrying with you in that image, of the whole busy day of the kitchen finally quieting, the great pot lifted off, the embers glowing softly under their grey blanket of ash, and the warmth of it holding steady in the dark until the household woke. It is very much the feeling of this hour of yours, now, and we will let the fire go on glowing quietly beneath everything else we speak of tonight. Let us turn now to the pot that hung above that fire, the everlasting pot, and to the thick, plain, endlessly useful pottage that was the true daily bread of the medieval world. If the fire was the heart of the kitchen, the pot that hung above it was the heart of the medieval diet. For the great mass of ordinary people, across century after century, the single most important dish was not roast meat, nor fine white bread, but pottage. Pottage was, at its simplest, whatever could be simmered together in the pot, a thick and comforting stew of grains, pulses, and above all the green herbs and vegetables that were grown for exactly this purpose and known, tellingly, as pot herbs. Into the pot went oats or barley to thicken it, dried peas or beans, an onion or a leek, and a good handful of whatever leaves the season offered, cabbage, kale, the young tops of nettles in spring, orache, beet leaves, parsley, a little salt bacon, or a bone might go in when the household could afford it, for flavor more than substance, and this pot, or one very like it, simmered over the fire on most days of most people's lives. We might pause on the idea of the everlasting pot, for it captures something true about how the poorer kitchen worked. In many households the pot was rarely emptied completely and started fresh. Instead it was topped up, day upon day, a fresh handful of grain and greens added to yesterday's remains, the whole kept simmering or gently reheated, so that the pottage was in a sense continuous, an ever-renewing meal that fed the family morning and evening without ever quite ending. There is a homely wisdom in this. The long, slow cooking made tough greens and hard pulses soft and digestible, drew what goodness there was out of a small piece of bone or bacon, and kept the food hot and safe to eat in a world with no other way to store it. The pot asked little and gave much, and it forgave a great deal. Let us turn now to the point that matters most for our evening, which is that the pot, herbs in that pottage were very often medicine as well as food. Here we come to the true heart of kitchen physic, the plain fact that in the medieval understanding there was no clear border between the greens you ate for supper and the greens you took as a remedy. The same plants did both, and the goodwife knew them in both roles at once. Consider the humble leek and the onion in the pot on almost every table. They flavored the pottage, yes, but they were also long trusted as remedies for the chest, simmered soft and eaten warm to ease a cough or loosen a stubborn cold, their pungency thought to cut through the thick humours that a winter chill laid down in the body. Or consider the colewort, the loose, leaved ancestor of the cabbage, one of the commonest pot herbs of all. It filled the pot and the belly, but its leaves, softened at the fire, were also laid warm upon aches and swellings and slow, healing sores, a poultice and a supper drawn from the very same bed in the garden. We turn now to parsley and fennel and the seasoning herbs that were quiet medicines too. The herbs added to the pot for savour were chosen, as often as not, with half an eye to what they did for the body as well as the tongue. Parsley, strewn into the pottage by the handful, was held to be good for the stomach and the water, gently encouraging the body to clear itself, and a sprig chewed after eating was thought to sweeten the breath and settle the digestion. Fennel and dill, with their soft feathery leaves and their warm seeds, went into fish dishes and pottages alike, and both had a long and gentle reputation for easing the wind and the griping that a heavy or hurried meal could bring on. A little fennel seed simmered in the pot was, in effect, both a seasoning and a mild remedy taken together, without anyone needing to draw a line between the two. Mint did the same, cooling and settling the stomach. Savory, warm and peppery, was added to beans and pulses partly for its taste, and partly because it was believed, with some justice, to make those windy foods sit more easily. The seasoning of a medieval pot was, quietly, a kind of daily dose of gentle physic, taken so habitually that no one thought to call it medicine at all. Let us turn now to the old idea that lay beneath all of this, the notion that food and medicine were points on a single line. To understand why the kitchen could be a pharmacy, it helps to understand how the people of the age thought about food. They did not divide the world into foods, which nourish, and medicines, which cure, in the sharp way a modern mind does. Instead, they saw a single continuous scale. At one end stood plain, nourishing food, at the other stood strong drugs, and in between lay a broad, comfortable middle ground of things that were a little of both, foods that leaned toward medicine, and medicines mild enough to be eaten daily. A dish of barley, cooling and moist, was food when you were well and physic, when you were feverish. A cup of warm ale with honey was supper on a cold night, and a remedy for a sore throat on a worse one. The famous old verses of the school of Salerno, a health guide in rhyme so popular that it was copied and recopied and eventually printed across all of Europe, are built entirely on this idea, giving page after page of homely advice on which foods warmed and which cooled, which suited the choleric and which the melancholy, treating the daily table as the first and most important place where health was either kept or lost. We turn now to the many faces of the pot, from the thinnest gruel to the richest broth. The pot was not one dish but a whole family of them, ranging by thickness and by richness according to who was to eat and why. At its thinnest it became gruel or water, gruel, little more than a spoonful of oatmeal, simmered long in water, or thin ale and strained smooth, the plainest food of all, and for exactly that reason the food most often given to the very sick, the very young, and the very old, who could manage nothing heavier. A shade richer was frumenty, wheat simmered slowly until it burst and softened into a thick, soothing porridge, often enriched with milk and a little honey. A dish that sat comfortably on the border between supper and restorative. Thicker and heartier still were the standing pottages, stiff enough almost to cut, made for hungry workers who had a long day's labor ahead. And at the wealthier table, the pot might hold a fine broth of capon or mutton, clear and strengthening, closer to what a physician would prescribe for someone mending from illness than to everyday fare. It is worth noticing that these were not really different dishes so much as the same dish drawn out along a scale, from the barest sustenance for the failing invalid to the rich restorative for the recovering one, all of it coming from the one pot and the one fire, adjusted by the goodwife's hand to whatever the moment asked. We turn now, to close this part of our evening, to the goodwife standing over that everlasting pot and the ordinary wisdom of it. Picture her there, in the last light of the day, lifting the lid to send up a cloud of savory steam, tasting, judging, reaching for a pinch more salt or a last handful of green. She was not thinking, as she did it, that she was practicing medicine. She was making supper as she had 1,000 times before and would 1,000 times again. And yet in the choosing of the herbs, in the long, slow cooking that made hard things soft and gentle, in the warmth she was about to set before a tired and perhaps ailing family, she was doing something that a physician in a university gown would have recognized at once as care of the body by way of diet, the oldest and, in many ways, the wisest branch of the whole healing art. The pot murmured, the fire glowed, and the first medicine of the household, the plain warm supper that kept a family in health across the long years, was very nearly ready. Let us turn now to the salt box and to the small white grains that were, in their quiet way, among the most precious things the kitchen held. On the shelf near the fire, or set into a warm nook in the wall to keep it dry, stood the salt box, and few things in the medieval kitchen were guarded with more care. Salt was not the cheap and endless thing it has since become. It had to be won, with real labor, either from the sea by long slow evaporation in shallow coastal pans, or dug from the great inland beds of rock salt, or drawn as brine from salt springs and boiled down over fires that swallowed whole forests of fuel. All of this made salt costly, and in some times and places costly indeed. It was traded across half the known world, fought over, taxed heavily by kings, who knew that everyone must have it, and paid, on occasion as wages, so that the very word salary carries the memory of it still. To a household, a good store of salt was a kind of wealth, and its keeping was one of the goodwife's most careful trusts. We turn now to salt at the table, and the quiet order it kept there. In wealthier homes the salt was honored with a vessel of its own, the great salt, a fine standing cellar of silver or pewter set in the middle of the high table, and where a person sat in relation to it mapped the whole order of the household at a glance. To sit above the salt, nearer the head of the table, was to be counted among the honored. To sit below the salt was to be of humbler rank, and the phrase kept its meaning in the language long after the great ceremonial cellars themselves had passed out of use. Even in the plainest cottage, where the salt lived in a simple wooden box or a scoop of horn, it was treated with a certain respect, dipped into sparingly, spilled only with a small anxious care, for to waste it was to waste something that had been hard to come by and would be hard to replace. Let us turn now to the great work of salt, which was to preserve, and to how deeply that mattered to the health of the house. Salt's first and greatest gift to the household was not seasoning but preservation, and preservation, in a world without any other reliable way to keep food, was very close to survival itself. Meat and fish, packed in salt or steeped in strong brine, could be kept sound for months, carrying a family through the lean cold season when nothing grew and little could be hunted. The autumn slaughter, when animals that could not be fed through the winter were killed, gave way at once to the great labor of salting. The tubs and troughs of the kitchen filled with joints laid down in salt against the hungry months ahead. Fish, above all the herring that came in vast shoals, was salted and barreled in enormous quantities, and became one of the chief foods of the age, especially through the many fast days of the church year, when meat was forbidden. None of this was thought of as medicine, and yet in the plainest sense, it kept whole populations alive and fed through the winter. And a well-fed household was a household far better able to weather the fevers and agues that thinned the hungry. The salt box, in this quiet way, was among the surest guardians of the family's health that the kitchen held. We turn now to salt as a remedy in its own right, reached for again and again about the house. Beyond its keeping of food, salt was a plain and trusted medicine, used so commonly that it hardly counted as physic at all. Warm salt water was, then as now, the household's first answer to a sore throat, gargled slow and often to ease the soreness, and though no one could have said quite why, to help the trouble pass. The same warm brine washed out a wound and rinsed a sore, and salt was rubbed gently on aching gums and loose teeth in the hope of firming them. A little salt in warm water served as a simple purge when the belly was thought to need clearing, and a poultice made with salt, its nature reckoned hot and dry, was laid on to draw out the cold, wet humours from a swelling or a chilblain. Salt was scattered too as a cleanser, strewn on tables and floors, and rubbed into boards to scour them sweet, so that the same grains that seasoned the supper also kept the kitchen itself wholesome. It was medicine, seasoning, preservative, and scouring powder all at once, and there was scarcely a day it did not serve in one of these roles or another. Let us turn now to a warm bag of salt, one of the simplest comforts the kitchen ever gave. Among the gentlest of all the household's uses of salt was one that asked nothing of it but its warmth. Coarse salt, heated dry in a pan over the fire, and then poured into a stout cloth bag and tied shut, held its heat for a long while, and such a bag, laid against an aching ear, a sore tooth, a griping belly, or a stiff and painful joint, gave a deep, dry, comforting warmth that a damp cloth could not. It was the sort of remedy every household knew, and few ever wrote down, made in a moment from what was always to hand, and given most often to a child crying with ear-itch in the night, or to an old body whose joints ached with the cold and the damp. There is a homely tenderness in the picture of it, the goodwife warming the salt at the banked fire in the small hours, testing the bag against her own cheek to be sure it was warm and not hot, and settling it with care against whatever ached, a small kindness costing nothing but the trouble of rising. We turn now to the different salts, and to the goodwife's careful eye in choosing among them. Salt was not all of one kind, and a practiced housewife knew the differences well. There was bay salt, coarse and greyish, won from the evaporation of seawater, and prized for the heavy work of salting down meat and fish, its large, slow, dissolving crystals thought to strike deep and keep well. There was finer white salt, refined by boiling and skimming until it was clean and pale, kept for the table and for the more delicate work of the kitchen. There was rock salt in some regions, dug from the earth and ground down for use. The goodwife judged her salt by its dryness, its color, and its cleanness, for damp or dirty salt could spoil a whole tub of carefully laid meat and waste a winter's provision at a stroke. Salt was kept, for this reason, in the driest and warmest place the kitchen could offer, near the fire and away from the damp of the walls, and a wise woman dried it out again at the hearth, if the wet weather had let it grow soft and clumped. All of this care went into a thing so common that it sat on every table, and yet so needful that its spoiling could mean real hunger in the months to come. Let us turn now to the long fasts, the mountains of salt fish, and the green cure that answered them. Because the Church of the Age set many days of fasting through the year, and above all the long 6 weeks of Lent, when meat, eggs, and often dairy were all forbidden, salted fish became for weeks on end the very foundation of the diet, especially among the poor. Barrel after barrel of salted herring and stockfish was eaten, soaked long in water to draw out the fiercest of the salt, and then simmered soft. It kept a great many people alive through the hungry end of winter, but a diet of little but salt fish and bread, stretching across the dark months, when no fresh green thing had grown for a long time, took its own quiet toll on the body, drawing it down into the weariness and the sore gums that later ages would learn to call scurvy. The kitchen's answer arrived at long before anyone understood the reason, was the eager welcome given to the very first green herbs of the returning spring. The young nettle tops, the watercress from the stream, the bitter leaves of scurvy, grass gathered from the coast, the fresh sprouting worts, all of these were seized upon and cooked into the pot the moment they appeared, and the old books urged them warmly as a cleansing of the blood after the long salted winter. It was, though no one framed it so, a piece of true kitchen medicine the spring greens answering the salt fish, the garden answering the barrel. We turn now to close to the old regard for salt as something almost more than ordinary. Salt held a place in the old imagination well above its plain white grains. It stood for hospitality, so that to share bread and salt with a guest was to promise them safety under your roof. It stood for faithfulness and for wisdom, and it turned up in the sayings and the scriptures of the age as a figure for whatever was most steadfast and most needful. A little was sometimes added to the churning of butter, and the brewing of all as much for luck, and for keeping as for taste, and a pinch spilled was thought to invite ill fortune, to be turned aside by the old habit, alive still, of casting a few grains back over the shoulder, all of this gathered around a substance whose real virtues, the keeping of food, the cleaning of wounds, the easing of a sore throat, were quiet and practical enough. But perhaps it is no wonder that a thing so needful, so hard won, and so plainly life-giving should have drawn such regard to itself, standing there in its worn box by the fire, the small white keeper of the winter's food and the family's health. Let us turn now from the salt box to the little locked chest beside it, and to the spices within, which were nothing less than the household's drug cabinet. If the salt box held the kitchen's most needful treasure, the small locked chest nearby held its most costly one. This was the spice chest, and in it lay pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, mace, nutmeg, and, most precious of all, saffron, brought at enormous trouble and expense from the far edges of the known world. In the earlier medieval centuries, these things traveled overland across Asia and by ship across the Indian Ocean, passing through hand after hand, each taking a share, so that by the time a few grains of pepper reached a kitchen in England or the Low Countries, they had come a journey almost beyond imagining and cost a price to match. Spices were wealth you could weigh. They were given as princely gifts, left carefully in wills, counted and locked away, and the mistress of a great house often kept the key to the spice chest on her own person, parting with a measure only as each dish or each remedy required. It is no accident that the same merchants who dealt in spices, the grocers and the spicers of the medieval town, were very often the same men who sold drugs and medicines, for in that age the two trades were nearly one, and the spice chest in the kitchen was, in plain truth, a cabinet of drugs. We turn now to why the spices were reckoned medicine at all, and to the old idea of their heat. To understand the spice chest as a drug cabinet, we must return to the old understanding of the four qualities: the hot, the cold, the moist, and the dry. Nearly every spice was reckoned hot and dry, most of them strongly so, and this made them powerful correctives in a system that saw much sickness as the fault of too much cold and damp in the body. A stomach that would not digest, a chest clogged with a winter's phlegm, a body chilled and sluggish, all of these called, in the physician's reasoning and the goodwife's alike, for something hot and dry to set them right. And the spices answered exactly. Pepper, ginger, and the rest were therefore not mere flavorings sprinkled for pleasure, but deliberate warming agents, added to food to help it digest and taken alone as remedies when the trouble was plain. The heavy spicing of medieval cookery, which can seem so strange to a later taste, was in part a matter of this reasoning, the seasoning of a dish and the balancing of its effect upon the body being, once again, the very same act. Let us turn now to ginger, the friendliest of the warming spices. Of all the spices, ginger was among the most loved and the most used in physic, for its heat was strong but kindly, and its help was quick to feel. Its great work was upon the stomach and the digestion. A little ginger, taken in warm ale or wine, or nibbled candied after a heavy meal, settled a queasy stomach, eased the wind and the griping, and warmed a body chilled through. It was given against the cold rims of winter, stirred into possets for a chill, and worked into all manner of comforting sweetmeats that were half confection and half medicine. Gingerbread itself, in its older and firmer forms, began life closer to a medicinal lozenge than to a child's treat, a stiff paste of breadcrumbs, honey, and a great deal of ginger and other spice, shaped and kept and eaten a piece at a time for the good it did the stomach. Of all the treasures in the locked chest, ginger was perhaps the one the household reached for most often, and with the least hesitation. We turn now to saffron, the costliest of them all, glowing gold in its tiny parcel. Saffron stood apart even among spices, for it was, by weight, one of the most expensive substances in the whole medieval world. It is made from the dried scarlet stigmas of a particular autumn crocus, and each flower yields only 3, gathered by hand, so that it takes many thousands of blossoms to make a single ounce, a labor that has kept saffron precious from that day to this. A household possessed it, if at all, in tiny amounts kept in a scrap of parchment or a little box within the greater chest. In cookery, a few threads colored a whole dish a rich and princely gold and lent it a faint, particular fragrance, and this color alone made saffron a mark of wealth on the table. But it was prized as a medicine too, reckoned a great cordial, a comfort to the heart and the spirits, given in small amounts to lift a heavy and melancholy mood, and thought to strengthen someone worn down by long illness. To spend saffron on a sick member of the household was to spend real treasure on their recovery, and it was done, when it was done, with a full sense of the cost. We turn now to pepper, the plainest and most familiar of the treasures in the chest. Pepper was, of all the true spices, the one most likely to be found even in a middling household, and though it too was costly, it was so useful and so wanted that people found the means to keep at least a little. Its small hard corns were ground fresh in the mortar as they were needed, for pepper loses its fire once ground and left, and a scattering went into a grate, many dishes to warm and sharpen them. As medicine, it was reckoned strongly hot, and it was given to rouse a sluggish stomach, to help the body throw off a cold, and to bring warmth to a chilled and shivering frame. A few grains of pepper in warm wine was an old comfort for a body that had taken a soaking, and it was worked into many a spiced remedy meant to drive out the damp. Its very commonness in the trade made it a kind of money in itself, so that rents were sometimes reckoned in peppercorns, and the phrase for a payment so small as to be merely a token, a peppercorn rent, keeps the memory of a time when even one corn of it was worth the naming. Let us turn now to the cloves and the cinnamon, and the particular troubles they were kept for. 2 spices in the chest were reached for so reliably against certain aches that they became almost fixed remedies. The clove, that small dark dried flower bud with its fierce warm bite, was above all the friend of the aching tooth. Held whole against a sore tooth, or its oil pressed onto the gum, it dulled the pain with a numbing warmth in a way that few other things could, and this use has proved so sound that it has never really been abandoned from that day to this. Cinnamon, the sweet fragrant bark, was gentler and was loved as a warming cordial, stirred into wine and possets to comfort the stomach and the heart, and it was trusted particularly against the flux and the looseness of the bowels, its binding warmth thought to settle a disordered belly. A household that kept even a little of each had, in effect, a remedy for the toothache and a remedy for the griping gut close at hand in the same small box, tucked in beside the flavors of the festival table. We turn now to the spiced comfits and electuaries, the sweetmeats that were also medicine. Some of the pleasantest medicine the kitchen made came straight out of the spice chest in the form of comfits and electuaries, and these sat so comfortably between the sweet and the physic that no one troubled to say which they were. A comfit was a seed or a sliver of spice, a grain of aniseed, a piece of caraway, a shred of ginger or of orange peel, coated over and over in hardened sugar until it became a small sweet, and such comfits were eaten after a meal to sweeten the breath and settle the stomach, kept in a little box and offered to a guest or a queasy child. An electuary was richer still, a soft paste of powdered spices, and herbs worked up with a great deal of honey or sugar into something between a jam and a medicine, taken by the spoonful for a cough, a weak stomach, or a general lowness. The old books are full of these, and their pages slide without any seam from a recipe for a spiced sweetmeat to a recipe for a comforting medicine, because to the goodwife making them at her table, the difference hardly signified. She was doing one thing, working the warming treasures of the chest up with honey into something her family would gladly take, whether for pleasure or for its good upon the body, and most often for both at once. Let us turn now, to close this part of our night, to the small daily ceremony of the spice chest itself. There was a quiet ritual to the spice chest that is worth holding in the mind as we move on. To open it was a small event. The key was turned, the lid raised, and out came a warm and complicated fragrance, sweet and sharp and resinous all at once, the smell of pepper and clove and cinnamon and dried ginger mingled together in the dark, a scent that spoke at once of the kitchen and of the far edges of the earth. From this the goodwife took her careful measures, a few peppercorns to be crushed in the mortar, a sliver of cinnamon bark, a pinch of powdered ginger for a posset, a single precious thread or two of saffron for a caudle or a festival dish. Then the lid came down and the key was turned again, and the treasure was shut safely away until it was next needed. In that small, repeated ceremony, performed 1,000 times across a household's years, lay the truth of the whole matter, that the medieval kitchen kept its most valued medicines, exactly where it kept its most valued flavors, in the one locked chest, because to the people who used them they were, in the end, very nearly the same thing. Let us turn now to the honey crock, standing sweet and heavy on its shelf, and to the gentlest medicine the whole kitchen possessed. Beside the salt and the spice stood a wide earthen crock, its rim sticky and its weight considerable, and within it lay honey, the great sweetener and the great comfort of the medieval household. We must remember that sugar, in these centuries, was itself a costly spice, kept in the locked chest and shaved from the loaf in small careful amounts, so that for most people, most of the time, honey was sweetness. It came, in the luckier households, from the family's own bees, kept in domed hives of coiled straw, called skeps, set in a sheltered corner of the garden, or in little niches built into a south-facing wall. Once a year the honey was taken, the comb cut, and the golden syrup let to drain slowly from it, and stored away in crocks against the whole year to come. A household with its own bees had, in that crock, a standing supply of sweetness, of light through the winter in the form of wax candles, and of one of the surest and kindest medicines known to the age, all from a creature that asked only a corner of the garden and a little quiet respect. We turn now to the first great work of honey in physic, which was to make the bitter bearable. A great many of the real medicines of the age were bitter or sharp or otherwise hard to swallow, and honey was the household's answer to that difficulty. A bitter decoction of herbs, a sharp powder, a dose that a child would fight and spit out, could be folded into a spoonful of honey and given down gently, the sweetness masking the worst of the taste and coaxing the remedy past an unwilling tongue. This was no small service. Half the art of giving medicine, especially to the young and the fearful, lay in making it possible to take at all, and honey made possible 100 remedies that would otherwise have been refused. Beyond the mere hiding of a taste, honey was thought to carry the virtue of a medicine gently into the body and to be, in itself, strengthening and restorative, so that the honey was never merely a disguise, but a part of the cure. The old preparations lean on it constantly, and the very shape of so many household remedies. A bitter herb worked up with honey into a soft electuary comes straight from this simple, kindly need to make the good medicine go down. Let us turn now to honey against the cough and the sore throat, its most familiar comfort of all. If there was one trouble the honey crock answered above all others, it was the cough and the raw sore throat of the cold season. And here honey has kept its place in the household from the medieval kitchen down to the present day, almost unchanged. A spoonful of honey, taken slowly, soothed a throat rubbed raw with coughing, and honey stirred into warm water or warm ale, often with a little added ginger or a squeeze of some sharp juice, made a warm and comforting draught for a chest heavy with a winter cold. One very old and very common remedy was honey and a roasted apple or an onion, the honey drawing a soft sweet syrup from the softened fruit that was sipped for a cough, and another was honey simmered gently with herbs such as horehound or hyssop into a thick cough syrup, kept by and given by the spoon. The comfort of these was real, and their kindness to a sick child in the night, a warm sweet spoonful easing a raw throat enough to let sleep come, is easy to feel across all the centuries between. We turn now to honey upon a wound, and to a use the old books praised that later ages have looked at again with respect. Honey was laid not only within the body but upon it, spread over wounds, burns, and slow, healing sores as a dressing. And here the practice of the medieval kitchen has proved wiser than it might once have seemed. The old books claim again and again that a wound dressed with honey stayed clean and sweet, drew together well, and was slower to fester than one left bare. And the goodwife who spread honey on a cut and bound it over was following advice already ancient in her own day, reaching back through the physicians of Greece and Rome to the earliest medicine we have any record of at all. Later ages, looking closely, have found real cause behind the old regard, for honey does indeed keep a wound clean in ways the medieval mind could never have explained, and this is why it is spoken of here calmly, as a piece of history that happened to be sound, rather than as any counsel for the present. What matters for our evening is that the same crock that sweetened the family's food also dressed its hurts, and did so with a gentleness the sick could feel. Let us turn now to oxymel, the marriage of the honey crock and the vinegar jug, one of the oldest and most trusted preparations of the household kitchen was oxymel, whose very name means, in the Old Greek, simply the sour and the sweet, and it was nothing more than honey and vinegar simmered together into a smooth, keeping syrup. This humble mixture bridged the two great stores of the kitchen, the sweet crock and the sour jug, and it was reckoned excellent for the chest, cutting and loosening the thick phlegm of a stubborn cough, and easing the breath, taken by the spoonful or stirred into warm water. Often it was made richer still with herbs or roots simmered in it, squill or hyssop or garlic, giving a whole family of oxymels for different troubles, but the plain honey and vinegar syrup was the foundation of them all, and a jar of it kept on the shelf was a ready remedy through the coughing months. It is a fine small emblem of kitchen physic, this oxymel. Made from two things every kitchen had, costing almost nothing, keeping for a long while, and answering one of the commonest complaints of the winter, all without a single ingredient that did not stand already within arm's reach of the fire. We turn now to mead and to metheglin, the honey turned to drink. Honey gave the household not only food and medicine, but drink, for honey and water left to work together fermented into mead, one of the oldest of all made drinks, and when herbs and spices were brewed into it, it became metheglin, whose very name in the Old Welsh carries the sense of a healing liquor. These honeyed drinks were made and kept in a great many households, and the spiced and herbed metheglins in particular slid easily from the table to the sickroom, warmed and given as a comforting cordial to someone chilled or low or mending from an illness. The old receipt books hold long recipes for them, each goodwife with her own blend of herbs, steeped into the honey drink, and the making of a good metheglin was counted among the accomplishments of a capable housewife. In these warm, sweet, faintly medicinal drinks the honey crock reached the table not as sweetness alone, but as comfort and mild physic together, another of the many places where the food and the medicine of the house ran quietly into one. Let us turn now close to the beeswax left behind and the salves it made. When the honey had been drained from the comb, the wax remained, and nothing of the bees' gift was wasted. Beeswax lit the better rooms of the house with a clean, sweet, smelling flame, far finer than the smoking tallow the poorer household made do with, and it sealed and polished and served a dozen small purposes. But for our evening its chief use was as the body of a salve, melted gently together with oil or with rendered fat, and whatever healing herbs the goodwife chose to steep in it, calendula petals, plantain leaves, elder flowers. The wax set the warm mixture into a smooth ointment that could be kept in a little pot, and spread on chapped hands, cracked lips, sore skin, and slow wounds through the whole hard winter. The making of these salves was a regular labor of the kitchen, and the beeswax that bound them came from the very same hives that filled the honey crock, so that the bees at the corner of the garden supplied the sweetening of the food, the comfort of the sickroom, the light of the evening, and the salving of the winter's hurts, all from the one quiet, humming corner It is little wonder the old custom held that such creatures deserved to be told the news of the house, and thanked, and treated almost as members of the household in their own right. Let us turn now from the sweet crock to the sour jug standing near it, and to Vinegar, the sharp and tireless servant of the kitchen and the sickroom alike. Where the honey crock held the kitchen sweetness, the vinegar jug held its sharpness, and the two were near neighbors on the shelf for good reason, since so much of the household's physic was made by marrying them. Vinegar was easy for the household to come by, for it made itself. All or wine left open to the air soared of its own accord, and a household kept the change going deliberately, feeding fresh liquor to a jug that already held a little vinegar and its cloudy living heart, the mother, until it had a steady supply of good sharp vinegar always to hand. This was one of the most useful things in the whole kitchen, and among the most various in its uses, for it cleansed, it preserved, it seasoned, and it healed, and there was scarcely a corner of the household's work it did not touch in one way or another. We turn now to vinegar as cleanser and wound wash, the sharp keeper of wholesomeness. Vinegar's bite made it a cleanser before anyone knew the reason, and the household reached for it constantly to keep things sweet and clean. It scarred and freshened surfaces, cut through grease and staleness, and rinsed out vessels that were to hold milk or medicine. Upon the body it served as a wash for wounds and sores, its sharpness thought to cleanse the hurt and keep it from turning foul, and a cut or a graze rinsed with watered vinegar and then bound was following a practice as old as medicine itself. It cooled, too. A cloth wrung out in vinegar and water and laid on the brow was a common comfort for a hot aching head or the heat of a fever, the sharp coolness of it easing the throb, and the same was pressed against bruises and swellings to take down their heat. In a world with few ways to keep either a wound or a sickroom clean, the sharp, familiar smell of vinegar was, quietly, one of the household's best defenses, and the jug that supplied it earned its honored place on the shelf many times over. Let us turn now to the gargle, and the wash for the mouth, and the small daily comforts of the sour jug. For the sore throat and the sore mouth, vinegar was a standby of the household. Watered well and often sweetened with a little honey, it was gargled to ease a raw and swollen throat. The same trouble the honey crock answered from its side, the two stores meeting once more in the sick person's cup. Vinegar and water made a wash for sore or bleeding gums, and for a mouth left foul by illness. And a mouthful swilled and spat was a plain freshening that cost nothing. Watered vinegar was drunk too, as a cooling and reviving draught in the heat, a thing the soldiers and laborers of the ancient world had known long before, a little sharpness in water making it more refreshing. And though no one could have said why, often safer than the plain doubtful water of a well. All of these were small uses, hardly worth the name of medicine, and yet they were reached for daily. And their sum across a household's year was a great quiet contribution to the comfort and the health of everyone under the roof. We turn now to verjuice and the sour sauces, the sharpness that seasoned and physic together. Alongside vinegar, the kitchen kept verjuice, the sharp green juice pressed from unripe grapes, or in the northern lands from crab apples, and this too was both a seasoning and a gentle physic. Verjuice gave the cooling soreness that medieval cookery loved to set against the richness of meat and the heat of spice. and this balancing was understood in the language of the humours, the cool moist sourness of the verjuice tempering the hot dry nature of a spiced or fatty dish, so that it sat more kindly on the stomach. The sharp sauces of the age, the green sauce of herbs and verjuice, the mustard beaten up with vinegar, the garlic sauces, were therefore not mere relishes, but were half understood as aids to digestion, set beside the food to help the body deal with it. Mustard in particular was both a fierce condiment and a plain remedy, its heat used as a plaster laid on the chest to draw and warm against a deep cold, so that the very same pot of mustard that sharpened the supper might, another day, be spread on a cloth and laid steaming on an aching chest. The sauce boat and the medicine chest, here as everywhere in this kitchen, were never very far apart. Let us turn now to the pickling crock and to vinegar as a keeper of the summer's plenty. Vinegar's sharpness did not only cleanse and heal, it preserved, and the pickling of the garden's surplus was one of the quiet labours by which a kitchen carried the taste and the goodness of summer into the dead of winter. Cucumbers and samphire, the buds and young pods of many a plant, walnuts taken while still green and soft, mushrooms, and a great array of roots and vegetables were laid down in spiced vinegar in crocks and jars, sealed against the air, and kept for the months when nothing fresh could be had. This was food, plainly, but it was quietly a matter of health as well, for a store of pickled things brightened the heavy salted winter diet with a welcome sharpness, and the sharp preserved vegetables, and the pickled sea plants such as samphire and scurvy. Grass carried some virtue of the fresh green into the barren season, easing in their small way the same winter weariness that the spring greens later cured outright. The pickling crock, sharp-smelling and tightly covered, was thus another of the kitchen stores of laid by health, the vinegar jug reaching forward to feed and freshen the family long after the garden itself had died back into the frozen ground. We turn now to the medicated vinegars, the sharp jug turned deliberately to physic. Beyond plain vinegar, the household-made vinegars steeped with herbs and flowers on purpose, keeping them by for particular troubles, and chief among these was the vinegar of roses. Red rose petals steeped long in good vinegar gave a fragrant rosy liquor that was a favourite remedy for the aching head, a cloth wetted in it and bound cool across the brow for the megrim, that heavy one-sided headache that laid a person low in a darkened room. The same rose vinegar cooled a hot fever and freshened a close and stuffy sick chamber, and it was reckoned a gentle comfort to the fainting and the overheated. Other herbs gave other vinegars, elder flowers, lavender, wormwood, rue, each steeped and strained and kept for its own use, so that a well-ordered shelf might hold several such bottles, the jug of plain vinegar for the everyday work of the kitchen, and the fragrant medicated vinegars beside it for the head, the fever, and the sickroom. Here again the line between the store cupboard and the medicine chest simply dissolved, the same sour liquor serving the salad, the scrubbing, and the aching head of the invalid, according only to what had been steeped in it and to what the moment required. Let us turn now, to close this part of our evening, to vinegar in the time of sickness, and the aromatic jug of the plague years. When sickness of the graver sort came near, vinegar took on a special place, for it was believed, above almost anything else in the house, to guard against the bad and corrupted air that the age blamed for the spread of disease. In times of pestilence, vinegar was sprinkled about the rooms. A sponge soaked in it was carried and held to the face, and it was steeped with strong aromatic herbs, rosemary, rue, wormwood, lavender, into a sharp, fragrant wash that people wiped on their hands and their faces and their doorways in the hope of keeping the sickness at bay. Out of this old practice grew the famous later tale of the aromatic vinegar of the four thieves, the robbers who were said to have plundered the houses of the dying and stayed well by washing in a herbed vinegar of their own, a story told and retold for centuries after. Whatever we make of the reasoning now, and whatever such washes truly did or did not do, the sharp, clean smell of vinegar in a fearful house was a comfort in itself, a sign that something was being done, that the rooms were being kept as sweet and clean as the household knew how. And with that fragrant sharpness lingering in the air, we may leave the sour jug on its shelf and turn to the cool, quiet corner of the kitchen where the milk and the butter and the whey were kept. Let us turn now, gently, from the sharp and the sweet to the cool and the quiet, to the dairy and the cold corner of the kitchen where the milk and the butter and the whey were kept. Every well-ordered household kept somewhere apart from the heat of the fire, a cool and shaded place for the things that would not bear warmth. And this was the dairy, or in a smaller home simply the coolest corner of the larder against the north wall, where the sun never reached and a draught of air could be let in. Here stood the shallow pans of milk set to rise, the crocks of butter, the cheeses on their boards, the bowls of curds and the jugs of whey, all of it kept as cool and as clean as the household could manage. For milk turns quickly, and a dairy left dirty or warm spoiled its whole store in a day. The dairy was, almost everywhere, a woman's particular craft and pride, and a good dairywoman was valued highly, for she turned the plain milk of the beasts into a whole family of foods that kept far better than the milk itself, and that fed and healed the household through the year. And of all these, several were counted as much medicine as food, so that the cool corner was, in its own quiet way, another shelf of the kitchen's pharmacy. We turn now to milk itself, and to its place as a food for the weak. Fresh milk, whether of the cow, the goat, or the iwi, was reckoned in the old understanding a cool and moist food, gentle and nourishing, and this made it a natural food for those whose bodies were thought too hot or too dry, and above all for the very young, the very old, and the sick. Milk warmed at the fire and given plain, or with a little bread broken into it, was among the softest and most soothing foods the kitchen could offer to someone who could manage little else, an invalid, too weak for solid meat, a fretful teething child, an old body worn thin by the winter. Goat's milk in particular was long held to be especially wholesome and easy on a delicate stomach, and where a household kept goats it was often the goat's milk that was carried to the sickbed. Milk was thought, too, to cool and soothe a body burning with the heat of a fever, or fretted by a sharp and biting complaint within. And though the physicians of the age argued much over when milk was safe to give, and when it might curdle and trouble a stomach, its gentleness and its nourishment kept it always among the first foods reached for when someone in the house fell weak. Let us turn now to whey, the thin, sweet drink left behind, and its long fame as a physic. When milk was set to make cheese, and the solid curds were drawn off, there remained the whey, the thin greenish liquid that a careless household might throw to the pigs, but a wise one kept and prized. Whey was reckoned a cooling, cleansing, and gently opening drink, and it had a great reputation across the centuries as a remedy for the heat of the body, for a sluggish and clogged constitution, and for the recovery of someone worn down by illness. It was drunk by the cupful, sometimes plain, sometimes with cooling herbs steeped in it, and there grew up in later ages whole fashions of taking whey as a cure. People traveling to the country in the warm months to drink it fresh and be restored, in much the way others took the waters at a spy. In the medieval and early modern kitchen, this was all far humbler, the whey simply drunk as it came from the day's cheese, making, given to the fevered and the costive and the low, a free and gentle medicine that was in truth nothing but the by-product of another labor, wasted by the careless and valued by the wise. We turn now to buttermilk and to the churn. Buttermilk, the thin sour liquid left when the butter had been churned and gathered out of the cream, was another of these dairy remedies that cost the household nothing beyond the labor already spent. Cool and pleasantly sour, it was drunk as a refreshing everyday draught, especially in the heat, and it was reckoned gently loosening to a bound belly and cooling to an overheated body. Upon the skin it had its uses too, for buttermilk was smoothed onto the face and hands to soften and whiten skin roughened by sun and wind and hard work. A homely cosmetic that doubled as a soothing wash for skin left sore or chapped. The churning that produced it was one of the great regular labors of the dairy. Long and tiring work with the dash rising and falling in the churn until the butter at last came, and it was hedged about with small customs and charms meant to help the butter gather. For a churning that would not turn was a real vexation and a waste of good cream. The buttermilk that ran off at the end of it all was the plain reward of that labor, poured out into cups for the household to drink cool on a warm day, food and gentle physic together once again. Let us turn now to butter and to its double life as food and as salve. Fresh butter was a food of comfort and of some little luxury, spread on bread, melted into pottage, worked into the finer dishes. And it was also, in the old reckoning, a soft and soothing thing upon the body. Fresh unsalted butter was smoothed onto burns and scalds to cool and ease them, rubbed into chapped and cracked skin, and used as the soft base into which healing herbs were worked to make a simple ointment when no other fat was to hand. Butter beaten up warm with a little ale or wine and some spice made a plain, comforting drink for a cold, and buttered ale, warm and rich, was given against a chill and a cough much as the honeyed drinks were. The old books even give butter, taken fresh and plain, as a gentle inward soother for a raw and griping gut. Salted butter, packed hard in crocks, was the keeping kind, laid by to see the household through the winter, when the beasts gave little or no milk, while the fresh sweet butter of the summer's plenty was the kind carried to the sick bed and worked into the salves. Between the two, the butter crock fed the family, comforted its colds, and dressed its burns, all from the churning of the summer's cream. We turn now to cheese, and to the old argument over whether it did more good or harm. Cheese was the great keeping food of the dairy, the way a household stored the goodness of the summer's milk against the whole year, pressed and salted and set to age on its boards, and a store of hard cheese was a real provision against hunger. Its place in physic was more argued over than that of the gentler dairy foods, for the old authorities warned that cheese, especially old and hard cheese, was heavy and slow and hard upon the stomach if eaten in excess. Yet the same authorities allowed that a small piece of cheese taken at the close of a meal helped to settle and seal the stomach and aid the digestion of what had gone before, and this belief that a morsel of hard cheese after dinner did the belly good has echoed down in household wisdom ever since. Soft, fresh cheeses and curds were reckoned kinder and more cooling, suitable even for the delicate, while the hard, aged cheeses were the strong keeping food of the labourer, filling and lasting, but to be eaten with more care. As with so much in this kitchen, the same food was medicine or burden according to who ate it, how much, and in what state of health, and the judging of that was exactly the goodwife's daily art. Let us turn now to cream, the richest gift of the milk, and its own soft comforts. Rising to the top of the standing milk was the cream, the richest part of all, and though much of it was gathered off for churning into butter, cream in its own right was a food of comfort and a soother of the body. Sweet cream was spooned over fruit and stirred into the finer dishes as a small luxury, and it was reckoned a soft, cooling, nourishing thing, kindly to a raw throat and a rough chest, so that a little sweet cream, or cream warmed gently with a spice, was given to ease a cough and soothe an inflamed and tender inside. Scalded cream, heated slow until it thickened rich and yellow, kept a little longer and was richer still, a delicacy carried to the invalid to tempt a failing appetite and build back a little strength. Cream was, besides, the beginning of many of the comforting sickroom drinks we shall come to later in the night, the base into which wine or oil was turned and spice was stirred, so that the pan of cream skimmed from the day's milk might end as the posset that settled a sick child to sleep. Soft, rich, and cooling, the cream was the gentlest thing the dairy gave, and it was spent, as such gentle things so often were, on the youngest and the weakest of the house. Let us turn now to close to the cool dairy as a store of quiet health. If we stand a moment in that cool shaded corner, we see the whole of the dairy's gift laid out, the pans of milk soft and nourishing for the sick and the young, the whey and the buttermilk cooling and cleansing for the fevered and the bound, the butter soothing burns and chapped skin, and enriching the invalid's cup, the cheese storing the summer's plenty against the lean months to come. None of it was thought of as physic in the way a bitter draught was, and yet the cool corner supplied, all told, some of the gentlest and most constant medicine in the house, food soft enough for the failing, drink cool enough for the feverish, and salves soft enough for a child's scald. It asked, in return, only care and cleanliness and the long patient labour of the dairywoman. And with its cool quiet held in the mind, we may leave it and cross the warm kitchen once more, to the great oven and the daily miracle of bread. Let us turn now to bread, and to the oven that baked it, for bread was the very floor beneath the whole medieval diet, and it too had its place in the sick room. Bread was the food the whole of medieval life was built upon, so much so that to earn one's bread meant simply to live, and the baking of it was among the greatest of the household's labours. In many places the bread was baked not at home, but at a common oven, a great domed brick or stone oven, often the Lord's, heated fierce with a wood fire raked out once the bricks glowed. The loaves then set in to bake in the stored heat, batch after batch as the oven slowly cooled, each thing baked in its turn as the falling heat suited it. A household with its own oven, built into the thick of the chimney wall, counted itself fortunate, and baking day was a fixed and heavy rhythm of the week, the whole kitchen given over to the kneading, the proving, and the baking of the loaves that would feed the family until the next. And this daily bread, so plain and so constant, ran into the household's physic at more points than one might expect. We turn now to the many breads, from the fine white loaf to the dark coarse bread of the poor. Bread was not one thing but many, ranked by the fineness of its flour exactly as people themselves were ranked, and this ranking mattered to health as much as to pride. At the top stood manchet, the fine white bread of the wealthy, made from the whitest bolted wheat flour, light and soft and easy to digest, and it was manchet above all that was carried to the sick bed and given to the delicate, for the old reckoning held the fine white bread to be the most wholesome and the gentlest on a weak stomach. Below it came the coarser wheaten breads, and below those the dark heavy breads of the poor, made of barley, of rye, of maslin which mixed rye and wheat together, or in the hungry years of beans, peas, and whatever else could be ground, dense and dark and filling. These coarse breads, though we might now think them the more wholesome, were reckoned by the physicians of the age harder and heavier and slower to digest, the food of those whose hard labor could deal with them. So when someone fell ill, the household reached, if it possibly could, for the finest white bread it could get, understanding the plainest loaf as itself a kind of graded medicine. The lighter the bread, the fitter for the weak. Let us turn now to the bread poultice, one of the commonest remedies the kitchen ever made. Bread left the belly and went upon the body in the form of the poultice, and the bread poultice was among the most familiar of all household remedies, made in a moment from what every kitchen always had. Bread was soaked and softened in hot milk or hot water, sometimes with a little fat or oil or a bruised herb worked in, and the warm soft mass was spread on a cloth and laid steaming on a boil, a swelling, an abscess, or a splinter deep in the flesh. As it lay there warm, it was thought to draw, to soften and ripen the swelling, and coax it to break and clean itself, and to ease the pain with its steady moist heat. A bread and milk poultice for a gathering sore, renewed warm every few hours, was the sort of thing a goodwife made without a moment's thought, and a child grew up seeing made 100 times. It was gentle, it was soothing, and it was always to hand, needing nothing the kitchen did not already hold, and it kept its place in the household long after grander medicines had come and gone. We turn now to the sop and the toast, the bread that went softened into the cup. Bread came to the sick most often of all in the cup, and the bowl softened into something an invalid could take. A sop was simply a piece of bread soaked in liquid until soft, and sops in wine, in warm ale, in broth or in milk were among the plainest and most constant sickroom foods there were, the bread carrying the nourishment and the comfort of the liquid in a form the weakest could swallow. Toast was pressed to the same service, a slice held to the fire until browned, and then floated in warm ale or wine. The browning thought to make it lighter and more settling to the stomach, so that toast in warm ale was given for a queasy belly and a low spirit alike. Brewers, bread soaked in the fat broth of the pot. fed the labourer his breakfast, and the invalid his gentle meal, according to how it was made. In all of these the bread was the vessel of comfort, the soft, warm carrier of milk or ale or broth into a body too weak for anything firmer, and the making of a good sop for a sick child or an ailing elder was one of the small tender arts of the kitchen. We turn now to the balm and to the twice baked breads kept for the week. The rising of the bread was itself a small mystery the household had long learned to master, for the light wheaten loaf was raised with leaven or with balm, and the balm was nothing other than the living froth skimmed from the brewing of the awl. In this the two great labours of the kitchen, the baking and the brewing, were joined at the root. The same living ferment that worked the awl also lifting the bread, so that a household that brewed had always the means to bake light, and the loaf and the tankard were cousins born of one quiet working. From the baking came, besides the daily loaf, certain breads kept especially for the sick and the delicate. Chief among these were the twice baked breads, the rusks and biscuit breads, cut and dried a second time in the falling heat of the oven until they were hard and dry, and would keep for a long while. These were reckoned particularly settling to a weak or queasy stomach, easy to keep by the sick bed, and softened in a little warm wine or broth, they made a light and gentle food for one who could stomach nothing richer. Spiced breads and simple sweet cakes, made richer with the treasures of the spice chest for festival days, carried their own warming comfort as well, half feast and half physic, like so much else that came out of this oven. Let us turn now, to close this part of our evening, to the trencher and to the old bread that was not wasted. Nothing of the bread was ever wasted, and even its oldest and hardest use touched on care for others. In many households the plate itself was bread, a thick slab of coarse stale loaf called a trencher, on which the food was served, and which soaked up the juices and the sauce through the meal. At the end of eating, these gravy-soaked trenchers were not thrown away, but gathered up, and in the greater houses they were given at the gate to the poor, so that the leavings of the wealthy table became the supper of the hungry, and the humble stale bread went out as a plain daily charity. Old bread served the kitchen in many another way besides, dried and ground to crumbs to thicken a broth or a posset, or to bind a dish, toasted to settle a stomach, soaked to poultice a sore, in a world that could never take its daily bread for granted. Not a crust of it was let go to waste, while any use remained, and the loaf that began as the family's supper ended as poultice, as thickening, as the poor man's meal, giving of itself right down to the last dry crumb. And with the warm smell of the baking still about us, we may turn from the oven to the cool crocks of all standing ready, and to the brewing that filled them. Let us turn now to the fat crock and the dripping pot, and to the rendered fats of the kitchen, for these too were medicine as surely as they were food. Near the cool larder, kept firm and covered, stood the crocks of fat, and in a world that wasted nothing of a hard, one beast, these were treasured. When the pig was killed in the autumn, its fat was carefully rendered down over a slow fire into pure white lard, and the hard fat about the kidneys became suet, and the fat of cattle and sheep was tried out into tallow, and every kind was stored against the year to come. The dripping pot caught the good fat and juices that ran from the roasting meat, and this savoury dripping was itself a prized thing. spread on bread as a meal in its own right. All of this was food, rich and warming, and precious in a diet that was often lean. But the fats of the kitchen had a second life that concerns us more tonight, for it was these same rendered fats that formed the very body of nearly every salve and ointment the household made, so that the crock by the larder was, in plain truth, the foundation of the medicine chest as well as the larder. We turn now to the salve itself, and to how the fat crock became an ointment pot. To make an ointment, the goodwife needed a fat to carry the virtue of the herbs and to hold them soft against the skin, and the rendered fats gave her exactly that. Clean lard, or fresh suet, or in the finer household's oil where it could be got, was melted gently in a pipkin over a low fire, and into it went the healing herbs of her choosing: calendula flowers for wounds, plantain and comfrey for bruises and sores, elder leaves, chickweed for an itching skin. The leaves bruised and steeped in the warm fat until it had drawn out their color and their virtue. The fat was then strained clean of the spent leaves and left to set firm in a little pot, sometimes with a knob of beeswax added to stiffen it, and there it kept, a green or golden ointment ready through the winter for every chapped hand, cracked lip, sore, and slow wound the season brought. The green salves that healed the household's hurts were, in this way, born directly of the autumn slaughter, and the rendering pot, the fat of the pig, and the herb of the garden married over the same small fire that cooked the supper. Let us turn now to goose grease, the great chest rub of the winter. Of all the fats the household kept, one held a particular fame in physic, and that was goose grease, the soft fat rendered from the goose. Rubbed warm upon the chest and the back and the throat, goose grease was the household's great remedy for the deep chest cold, the tight cough, and the wheezing breath of winter, the warm oily rubbing thought to loosen and draw out the cold that had settled in the chest. It was worked in by the fire, often with a little added spice or a warming herb, and the sufferer was then wrapped warm and settled by the hearth, and this soft, greasy comfort was given to young and old alike through every coughing season. So fixed was its reputation that a store of goose grease was laid by each year against the winter's colds, as deliberately as any medicine on the shelf, and the memory of it as the friend of a heavy chest lingered in country households for centuries after. It is a homely picture, the warm goose grease rubbed on a child's chest at bedtime, and the child then tucked close by the banked fire, and it carries the whole spirit of kitchen physic in one small tender act. We turn now to marrow, the rich heart of the bone, given to the weak. Within the great bones lay the marrow, soft and rich, and this the kitchen prized as one of its strengthening foods, especially for those worn thin by illness. Marrow, bones were simmered long in the pot to yield their richness into a broth, and the soft marrow itself was drawn out and spread on toast, or given by the spoon to someone who needed feeding up, a rich and gentle nourishment for a body too weak to take much, but able to take a little of something strong. In the old reckoning, marrow was a restorative, warming and building, given to the convalescent and the failing to help them gather their strength again, and a good marrow bone was carried to the sickroom the way another delicacy might be carried to a feast. Here the kitchen's fat served not as salve, but as food of the richest and most concentrated kind, the store of the beast's own strength offered up to rebuild the strength of the sick. another quiet passage between the supper table and the bedside. Let us turn now to tallow, the hard fat that gave both light and physic. The hardest of the fats, tallow, had its own uses about the house. Tallow made the common candle and the rushlight that lit the poorer rooms, a smoking, guttering, plain light, but a light all the same through the long dark evenings. And tallow found its way into physic too, chiefly in the drawing plasters and the stiffer salves, melted with resins and waxes and herbs into the firm plasters that were spread on cloth or leather and laid warm on the chest, the back, or an aching place, to warm and to draw over many hours. These plasters, half kitchen, made and half the work of the more skilled hand, kept the warmth and the virtue pressed against the skin far longer than a loose ointment could, and the tallow that stiffened them came from the same rendering as the candle that lit the sickroom where they were laid on. Thus even the humblest and hardest of the kitchen's fats gave both light against the dark and physic against the cold, drawn from the beast that had also given its meat to the pot. We turn now to the fats as a guard against the weather, and to the old May butter. The fats of the kitchen guarded the body from the outside, as well as feeding it from within, and in a world of hard outdoor labor and biting winter weather, this mattered a great deal. Rendered fat and tallow were smoothed onto hands and faces cracked by frost and wind, rubbed into feet and heels worn sore, and worked into the leather and the wool that clothed the household against the wet, so that the same crock softened the skin and weather-proofed the boots that kept the skin dry. There was, besides, an old and curious regard for butter made in the month of May, when the beasts first went out onto the rich new spring grass, and this May butter, often left unsalted and set out in the sun to work and change, was kept apart and treasured through the year as a healing thing above ordinary butter, worked into salves and rubbed on aches and hurts and sore udders and stiff joints alike. Whatever true virtue lay in the season of its making, the keeping of a special pot of May butter for the medicine chest shows once more how finely the household watched the turning year, laying by not only its food, but its very remedies at the moment. Each was thought to be at its best and strongest. We turn now to the whole quiet economy of the Fat Crock. Standing back from the crocks and the dripping pot, we see once more the deep thrift that ran through the whole of this kitchen, in which nothing of a hard, one animal was ever let go to waste, and everything served more than one turn. The fat that fried the food and enriched the pottage was the same fat that carried the healing herb into an ointment, that rubbed warm on a coughing chest, that stiffened a drawing plaster, that lit the room where the sick lay. The beast killed in the autumn fed the family through the winter, and, through its rendered fat, healed and warmed and lit them too, right down to the last white scraping in the bottom of the crock. It is a plain and unglamorous corner of the kitchen, the shelf of fats by the cool larder. And yet, without it, half the medicine chest could not have been made at all. And with the salves set firm in their little pots, we may turn to the ropes of onions and the braids of garlic hanging near the door, which were medicine of another and sharper kind. Let us turn now to the onion rope and the garlic braid, hung to dry near the kitchen door, for in these plain, pungent bulbs the household kept some of the strongest everyday medicine it had. Few sights were more ordinary in the medieval kitchen than the ropes of onions, and the plaited braids of garlic hung up to dry and keep, near the door or in the airy part of the store, ready to be pulled down as the pot or the sick bed required. These were among the most universally grown and eaten of all foods, cheap, keeping well through the winter when so much else failed, and flavouring the plainest pottage into something a body could relish. But onions and garlic and their kin, the leeks and the chives, were never only food. They were reckoned strongly hot and pungent, and this fierce heat made them, in the old understanding, powerful medicines for driving out the cold, the damp, and the corruption that lay behind so much sickness, so that the same braid that seasoned the supper hung, ready as one of the surest remedies in the house. We turn now to garlic itself, the poor man's treacle. Garlic held a place in physic out of all proportion to its humble price, and it earned across the centuries a name that tells the whole story, for it was called the poor man's treacle. Treacle, in the old sense, meant not a syrup, but theriac, the grand and costly compound medicine of many ingredients, that was reckoned the great guard against poison and pestilence. And to call garlic the poor man's treacle was to say that this cheap, sharp bulb, which any cottager could grow, did for the poor what the apothecary's dear theriac did for the rich. Garlic was eaten and given against the plague and the pestilent air, chewed to guard the one who tended the sick, laid on wounds and sores to keep them from festering, given against worms in children, and taken for a heavy chest and a stubborn cough. Much of this old regard has since been found to rest on something real, for garlic does indeed have virtues the medieval mind could not have named, and this is why it is spoken of here calmly, as a piece of history that happened to be wiser than it knew. To the household it was simply the sharp and trusted friend hanging by the door, the cheap defense of the poor against the worst that the year might bring. Let us turn now to the onion, and to the syrups and poultices made from it. The onion, milder than garlic but pungent enough, was the workhorse of this pungent family in the sickroom. Its most familiar remedy was the onion cough syrup, an onion sliced and layered with honey or sugar, and left to stand until it drew out a sweet, sharp, oniony syrup, which was then spooned out for a cough and a cold, a remedy so simple and so kindly that it never left the household repertoire. Roasted soft in the embers, an onion became a poultice, and a hot roasted onion held against the ear was the old comfort for the earache that woke children crying in the night, its warmth and its steam easing the deep ache within. The same soft roasted onion was laid on boils and swellings to draw them, much as the bread poultice was, and onion juice was dropped and dabbed on stings and small hurts. The onion that made the poorest supper savoury was thus, on another evening, the syrup for the cough, and the poultice for the ear, pulled down from the same rope by the same door for whichever the night required. We turn now to the leek and the chive, the gentler cousins. The leek, milder and sweeter than the onion, was one of the oldest and most honoured of the pot herbs, so bound up with some of the peoples of these islands that it became a very emblem of them. In physic it was reckoned good for the chest, and the breath, simmered soft, and eaten to loosen a cough and clear the pipes, and its juice was given for much the same troubles as the onions, if more gently. The chive, smallest and mildest of all, was snipped fresh over food as much for its gentle wholesomeness as its savour. All of these shared in the family's warming, cleansing nature, and all were valued the more because they grew easily, kept or came again year on year, and asked little of the poor gardener who most needed what they gave. Between the fierce garlic, the workaday onion, the honoured leek, and the gentle chive, the household had a whole graded range of this pungent physic, from the strongest guard against pestilence down to the mildest daily savour, all of it hanging in ropes and braids, or standing green in the garden bed. We turn now to the raw and the cooked, and to the judging of so strong a medicine. The very strength of the alliums meant that the household had to judge with some care how they were given, for the same bulb was a milder or a fiercer thing, according to whether it was eaten raw or cooked. Raw garlic and raw onion were reckoned fiercest of all, hot and biting, and it was in this raw state that they were given for the strongest purposes, chewed against the pestilent air, laid raw upon a stubborn sore, taken for the worm, when the trouble was thought grave enough to want the full force of them. Cooked, by contrast, they grew gentle, their fierceness softened by the long, slow simmering that turned them sweet and mild in the pot, and in this kinder form they could be eaten freely by all, even the delicate, nourishing and warming without troubling the stomach. So the Goodwife had, in a single bulb, both a strong medicine and a gentle food, and she chose between them by the plain act of cooking or not cooking, giving the fierce raw clove where a fierce remedy was wanted, and the soft cooked one where only warmth and nourishment were needed. It was one more small instance of the judgment that ran through the whole of her physic, the reading of how strong a dose a body and a trouble called for, made here with nothing more than the pot and the fire. We turn now to the wild garlic of the spring woods, the free physic of the returning year. Before the planted garlic and onions of the store came into their own, the returning spring offered a wild cousin for the gathering, and the household knew it well. In the damp woods and along the shaded banks there spread, in the early months, great sheets of ramsons, the broad-leaved wild garlic whose green pungent leaves scented the whole wood with their smell, and these were gathered by the basketful and cooked into the pot and the sauce, welcomed as one of the first green things of the year. Like its garden kin, it was reckoned cleansing and warming, and it came at exactly the season when the body, dulled by the long salted winter, was thought most to need such a clearing and freshening, so that the wild garlic of the March woods took its place beside the young nettle and the watercress as part of the spring's gentle cure. It cost nothing but the walk to gather it. It grew where no one had planted it, and it gave the poorest household a share in the pungent physic that the Braid by the door supplied to those who had gardens of their own. In this the wild wood itself became, for a few green weeks, an extension of the kitchen store, offering its sharp free medicine to anyone who knew the leaf. Let us turn now, to close this part of our evening, to the store by the door as a winter's medicine laid by. There is something fitting in where these plants were kept, hung up plainly by the door and in the store, neither locked away like the precious spice, nor tended like the delicate herb, but left out in the ordinary traffic of the house, always to hand. For that was exactly their character, the plain, cheap, reliable medicine of everyday life, needing no key and no ceremony, pulled down as freely for the cough and the earache as for the pot. A good rope of onions and a fat braid of garlic laid by in the autumn, were a quiet insurance against the whole coming winter, food for the lean months, and remedy for the colds and chest troubles the cold would surely bring. And the poorest household that could grow nothing else could very often grow these. In the sharp smell of them hanging by the door was the plainest truth of kitchen physic, that the surest medicines were not always the dearest or the rarest, but very often the humblest things of all, grown in the poorest patch of ground and hung up by the door against the day they would be needed. And with that sharp scent about us, we may turn from the store to the cool crocks of Isle, and to the brewing that was among the Goodwife's greatest labours of all. Let us turn now to the brewing of the house all, for all was the common drink of the whole medieval world, and the brewing of it was among the greatest and most constant of the Goodwife's labours. In a world where the water of many a well and stream was doubtful and often dangerous, all was not a luxury, but the everyday drink of nearly everyone, from the greatest to the least, taken at every meal and through the working day. Most of it was small ale, weak and thin and mildly nourishing, brewed to be drunk fresh and in quantity, and a household got through a great deal of it. For most of the medieval centuries, the brewing of this all was women's work, done at home by the goodwife or, in many a village, by the alewife who brewed a larger batch and sold the surplus to her neighbours, hanging out a bush or an ale stake above her door to show that a fresh brewing was ready. Whether brewed for the family alone or for sale, ale-making was a heavy, skilled, and regular labour, and a good brewster was valued as highly as a good baker or a good dairy woman, for the health and the cheer of the household leaned heavily on the ale she made. We turn now to the making of it, and to the malt and the mash. The brewing began with malt, which was barley, or sometimes oats or wheat, that had been steeped in water until it sprouted and was then dried, a process that turned the hard grain sweet and fit for brewing. The malt was crushed and steeped in hot water in a great tub. The mash and the sweet liquor drawn off from it was the wort. This wort was boiled, in the earlier centuries, with whatever herbs the brewster favoured, and in the later ones increasingly with hops, which kept the ale sound for far longer. And then it was cooled and set to work with a little balm, the living yeast saved from the last brewing, until it fermented into ale. The first and strongest running of the mash gave the good strong ale kept for guests and feast days, and for the strengthening of the sick, while the later, weaker runnings gave the small beer for everyday drinking. All of this asked long hours of heavy, hot, watchful work, and a brewing that turned sour through carelessness or ill luck was a real loss. So that the brewster's charms and cautions around her tubs were as earnest as the dairywoman's around her churn. Let us turn now to ale as food and safe drink, the liquid bread of the poor. Ale was drink, but it was very nearly food as well, for the small ale that everyone drank carried some real nourishment from the grain it was made of, so that it was aptly called the liquid bread of the poor. In a lean diet it added something to the day's sustenance, and being made with boiled water and slightly soured by its brewing, it was far safer than the raw water it replaced, sparing those who drank it much of the sickness that foul water brought. Weak small ale was given even to children, and to the sick and the aged thinned and warmed, as a safe and gently nourishing drink when plain water was not to be trusted, and a warm cup of mild ale was one of the plainest comforts offered to anyone low or ailing. This everyday, unremarkable roll of ale, as the safe and nourishing drink of the whole household, was in truth one of its greatest services to the general health, quietly saving more lives across the centuries than any grander medicine on the shelf. We turn now to the medicated ales brewed on purpose for the body. Because ale was drunk by everyone every day, it made a natural vehicle for physic, and the household brewed or steeped medicinal ales for particular troubles, giving the remedy in the very form the family was most willing to take. Wormwood ale, bitter with the steeped herb, was a favorite tonic for a weak or clogged stomach and a poor appetite, drunk to sharpen the digestion, and, it was hoped, to clear the body of worms. Scurvy grass ale, brewed with the sharp cress, like herb, was taken as a great spring cleanser after the salted winter, much sought for the sluggishness and sore gums that the season left behind. Sage ale, bitony ale, and many another were steeped for the head, the nerves, and the general strengthening of the constitution, and a household might keep a small brewing of some such medicated ale by through the season. It was thought most needed. In these the ale cup became the medicine cup, without ceasing to be the ale cup, the bitter or the wholesome herb, carried into the body on the same familiar drink that washed down every ordinary supper. Let us turn now to the warm spiced ale, the comfort of a cold night. When the cold bit hard or a chill had been taken, the household turned ale to comfort by warming and spicing it, and few remedies were more welcomed. Ale set by the fire until it steamed, sweetened with a little honey or sugar, and warmed through with ginger, cinnamon, or a clove or two from the chest, made a fragrant, heartening draught that eased a cold, soothed a rough throat, and sent a chilled body gladly to its bed. A hot poker or a heated iron plunged into the tankard would warm it in a moment and lend it a faint, toasted savour besides. This warm spiced ale was the plain kin of the grander mulled and spiced drinks of the feast, and it shaded, by only a small further step, into the Caudles and Possets we shall come to next. For once the warm spiced ale was thickened with egg, or curdled with milk, it became those very things. A warm cup of spiced ale by the fire on a bitter night was medicine and comfort in one. And it is a fitting last picture of the ale house corner, the tankard steaming gently on the hearth while the cold pressed at the shutters outside. We turn now to new ale and stale, and to the old care over which was given to whom. The goodwife judged her ale not only by its strength but by its age, for fresh new ale and older kept ale were reckoned to work quite differently upon the body. New ale, still working and full of its own lively ferment, was held to be windy and to trouble a tender stomach, apt to gripe and swell a body already out of sorts, and so it was kept from the sick and the delicate. Ale that had settled and cleared and grown a little older was thought kinder and more wholesome, and it was this settled ale, mild and clear, that was warmed for an invalid or thinned for a child. Stale in that old sense did not mean spoiled but well kept, and a clear settled all of the right age was among the safest things the household offered the weak. There was a whole quiet judgment in this, the brewster tasting and watching her barrels, knowing which was fit for the harvest table and which for the sick bed, and drawing from each according to who was to drink. It was one more of the countless small decisions by which the goodwife matched what the house, had to what each body under its roof could bear, the very habit of mind that made her the household's physician in all but name. We turn now to close to the good ale set by for the sick and the celebrating alike. The strong ale, the good first brewing kept back from the everyday small beer, had its own honoured place, laid down to age a little and brought out for guests, for feasts, and for the mending of the sick. A cup of strong, nourishing ale was reckoned a restorative for one worn down by illness or hard labour, building strength back into a wasted frame. And the very same strong ale was central to the caudle brewed for a woman after childbirth. So the brewster's finest work served both ends of life's road at once, cheering the wedding and the harvest feast, and comforting the childbed and the sickroom, poured out for celebration and for care from the same treasured barrel. And with a cup of that good ale warming in the hand, we may turn from the brewing to the two gentle drinks the kitchen made from it, and from the milk beside it, the caudle and the posset, the great comforting draughts of the medieval sickroom. Let us turn now to caudles and possets, the two great warm drinks of the sickroom. For if the kitchen ever made anything that was purely and simply comfort, it was these. When someone in the household fell ill, or took a chill, or lay weak after a fever or a birth, the kitchen answered above all with a warm, sweet, spiced drink, thickened and nourishing, made to be sipped slowly and to comfort as much as to cure. These drinks went by two great names, the posset and the caudle, and between them they were the very heart of sickroom cookery, made countless times in countless kitchens across the centuries, so beloved and so constant that special vessels were shaped for them alone. Both were built from the plain stores we have already walked among tonight, the ale and the wine, the milk and the cream, the eggs, the honey and the sugar, the spices from the locked chest, gathered and warmed together at the fire into something greater and gentler than any of its parts. To make one for an ailing member of the house was among the tenderest of the goodwife's regular acts, and to receive one, warm in the hands in a darkened room, was to feel oneself cared for. We turn now to the posset, the drink of curdled milk. The posset was made by curdling hot milk or cream with an acid drink, most often ale or wine, so that it separated into two parts, a soft curd rising to the top and a thinner spiced liquor lying beneath, and both were taken together or in turn. Hot milk was poured onto the ale or the wine and left a moment to turn, and it was sweetened and spiced generously with sugar or honey, with nutmeg, cinnamon, and ginger, until it became a rich, warm, fragrant thing. The grander possets, the sack posset made with the strong sweet wine called sack, thickened often with egg and enriched with cream, were dishes fit for a celebration as much as a sickbed, served at weddings and at the lying in of a new mother. The plainer ale posset was the everyday comfort, given for a cold, a chill, or a sleepless and feverish night. Special posset cups and posset pots were made to serve them, some with a spout set low in the side, so that the smooth spiced liquor could be sucked up from beneath the curd, and a fine posset pot was a treasured thing in many a household, brought out whenever the drink was called for. Let us turn now to the caudle, the warm, thickened cup of the invalid. The caudle was close kin to the posset, but was built on ale or wine rather than milk, and it was thickened, most often with the yolks of eggs beaten in, or with fine oatmeal or breadcrumbs, until it was smooth and a little substantial, halfway between a drink and a thin warm gruel. Warm ale or sweet wine was sweetened and spiced, and then thickened gently over the fire, with great care not to let the egg curdle into threads, and the result was a warm, nourishing, easily swallowed cup for one too weak to take solid food. A white caudle was made pale and delicate, an ale caudle plainer and more everyday, a wine caudle richer for one who needed building up, because it was at once warm, sweet, spiced and nourishing, and slipped down so easily. The caudle was the very archetype of invalid food, the thing carried to the bedside of the fevered, the frail, and the mending, sipped slowly through a long night, and thought to warm the body, settle the stomach, and coax a little strength back into the weak. We turn now to the caudle of the childbed, the drink of the lying-in. Of all the occasions for a caudle, none was more fixed than the birth of a child, and the groaning caudle or lying in caudle held a place all its own in the customs of the household. A woman brought to bed of a child was tended for days or weeks in her darkened, warmed chamber, and through this lying in she was comforted and strengthened above all with caudles, rich, warm, sweet, and spiced, made especially generous with wine and egg, and the treasures of the spice chest to build back the strength that the birth had cost her. The women who gathered to attend and support her, the midwife, and the female neighbors and kin, shared in the caudle too, so that the drink became bound up with the whole female gathering around a birth. A warm cup passed among the women in the close candlelit room. It was one of the moments when the kitchen's comfort was most needed and most freely given. The fire kept burning, the caudle kept warm, the new mother and her helpers sustained through the long days by the goodwife's steady, spiced, nourishing draughts. We turn now to the eggs and the rich additions that made these drinks restorative. Much of what gave the caudle and the richer posset their strengthening virtue came from the things stirred into them, and chief among these were eggs. The yolks of eggs, beaten into a warm caudle, thickened it, and enriched it, and were reckoned deeply nourishing, so that an egg caudle was among the most building of all the sickroom drinks, given to those most in need of strength, the new mother, the wasted invalid, the failing old. Beyond the egg, the goodwife enriched these drinks according to the sufferer and her means, stirring in a little of the marrow drawn from a bone, a few dates or raisins of the sun simmered to sweetness, ground almonds for richness, a thread of the precious saffron for a cordial that would comfort the heart, or a spoonful of a fragrant distilled water. Each addition was chosen with half a mind to its virtue, as well as its savour. The egg for strength, the saffron for the spirits, the warming spice for a chilled body, so that the finished cup was a small, considered medicine as much as a comfort. In building up such a drink from the plain ale or cream with these rich and chosen additions, the goodwife was doing in little exactly what she did across her whole kitchen, turning ordinary food, by choice and by care, into physic fit for the one who most needed it. We turn now to the aliberry and the humbler thickened drinks between caudle and gruel. Between the rich caudle of the wealthy childbed and the plain water gruel of the poorest sick bed lay a whole gentle family of thickened warm drinks, and the household drew from all of them according to its means and the sufferer's need. Chief among the humbler ones was the aliberry, whose homely name is worn down from all and brie, meaning simply all broth, a comforting drink of mild, all boiled up with oatmeal, and sweetened and spiced, thicker and more filling than a caudle and cheaper to make, given to a labouring family's sick, without the costly wine and egg. Thinner still was a warm all thickened, only with a little bread or meal. Closer to the gruel we met at the everlasting pot, and richer than any was the full egg caudle of the manor. What matters is that these all lay along a single unbroken scale, from the plainest warm thickened all that a cottager could make to the finest spiced posset of the great house, and every household found its own place upon it, making with what it had the warmest, most nourishing, most easily swallowed comfort it could contrive for whoever lay ill. The name and the richness changed from door to door, but the kindly idea beneath them all, a warm, sweet, thickened cup for the weak, did not. Let us turn now, to close this part of our evening, to the gentle sleep that such drinks were meant to bring. There is a reason these warm, sweet, spiced drinks feel so fitting to speak of at this hour, for beyond their nourishment and their easing of a cold, much of what a posset or a caudle offered was simply comfort and rest. Warm and sweet and heavy in the stomach, given last thing in a quiet, darkened room. They settled the body and calmed the mind, and helped a troubled or feverish sufferer drift down at last into sleep, and this drawing on of gentle sleep was understood to be half the cure. A restless invalid, a fretful child, a woman worn out by a birth, all were sent toward rest with a warm posset in the dusk, and the drink and the sleep it brought were reckoned together as the kindest medicine the kitchen could give. It is very much the spirit of this hour of yours, and if the thought of a warm, spiced cup, sipped slowly in a candlelit room, while the fire burns low, has made your own eyes a little heavier, then it has done tonight exactly what it was always meant to do. And with that warmth held in the mind, we may turn to the plainer, stronger foods the kitchen made for the sick, the broths and the restoratives that fed a body back to health. Let us turn now to the broths and the restoratives, to the plainer, but stronger foods the kitchen made for the sick, for feeding a body back to health was perhaps the most delicate art the Goodwife practiced. When someone lay truly ill, past the point where a warm posset would answer, the kitchen faced its subtlest task, the feeding of a body that could take almost nothing, and yet must somehow be nourished if it was to mend. Here the Goodwife drew on a whole quiet tradition of invalid cookery, of foods made soft, strong, and easy to take, given a spoonful at a time, tempting a failing appetite, and slipping nourishment past a stomach that would rebel at anything coarse. This was cookery of the gentlest and most careful kind, watched over hour by hour, and it shaded so wholly into medicine that the physicians of the age gave it their close attention, for they knew, as the Goodwife knew, that the right food carefully given did more to bring a sick body back than almost any drug. The broths and jellies and thin, nourishing drinks of the sickroom were, in the truest sense, the kitchen's finest physic. We turn now to the broth of the capon, the great restorative of the sick. Chief of all the invalid foods was a good broth of chicken or capon, and this held its place at the head of sickroom cookery for as long as such things were made. A fowl was simmered long and gently in water until it had given all its goodness into the liquid and the clear light. Savory broth that resulted was the very first strong nourishment offered to one beginning to mend, easy to take, warming, and thought to carry the pure strength of the meat in a form the weakest stomach could bear. cock broth in particular, made from an old bird, simmered for many hours, sometimes with strengthening herbs and roots, and even spices, or a little wine added, was reckoned a powerful restorative, given to those worn thin by long illness. To make a good broth for the sick was among the plainest yet most valued acts of the kitchen, and a bowl of it carried warm to the bedside was often the turning point at which a body began, slowly, to take food again and to gather back its strength. Let us turn now to the cullis, the strong strained essence of the broth. Where even a plain broth was too much, the kitchen made something stronger yet gentler. The cullis, a rich strained restorative that concentrated the goodness of meat into a smooth and easily swallowed essence. A capon, and sometimes veal or mutton besides, was simmered very long, and then pounded and strained until the broth was thick, smooth, and deeply nourishing, enriched at times with ground almonds, with bread, or with the yolks of eggs, and gently spiced. The cullis was, in effect, the strong beef tea and the invalid jelly of its age, made for those so weak they could take only the smallest quantity, so that every spoonful had to carry the most nourishment it could. It was a food made with real trouble, and often with real expense, and to make a cullis for a sick member of the house was to spend the kitchen's best effort on their recovery, distilling a whole fowl down to a few precious restorative spoonfuls to be given slowly through a long and anxious day. We turn now to barley water, the cooling drink of the feverish. Not every sickness called for strengthening, for the hot and feverish body was thought to need cooling and soothing instead, and here the kitchen turned to barley. Barley boiled long in water gave a thin, mild, slightly thickened drink, barley water, which was reckoned cooling, soothing, and gently cleansing, and it was the great standby for the fevered, the thirsty, and those with a soreness or heat within. Sipped cool or lukewarm through a fever, often sharpened with a little sharp juice, or sweetened with honey, it eased the thirst and cooled the body without burdening the stomach, and it soothed a raw and irritated inside. Barley itself was held to be the most cooling and wholesome of the grains, and barley water was accordingly among the most universal of all invalid drinks, made in a moment from the plainest of stores and given freely to anyone burning with a fever. It asked almost nothing and troubled the body not at all, and for that very reason it was reached for again and again through every fevered night. Let us turn now to almond milk, the gentle nourishment of the fast days and the sick bed. One of the most useful of all the kitchen's soft foods was almond milk, made by pounding blanched almonds to a paste with water and straining it into a smooth, rich, white liquid that looked and served much as milk did. This had two great virtues. First, being made of no animal thing, it could be used through the long fasts of the church year, and above all through Lent, when milk and dairy were forbidden, so that the many dishes ordinarily bound with milk could be made instead with almond milk and eaten without breaking the fast. Second, it was cooling and nourishing and easy to digest, and so it served the sick and the delicate exactly when true milk was thought to disagree with them, or was not to be had. Almond milk thickened gruels and possets, enriched broths, and made a gentle drink in its own right, and it was reckoned a fine nourishment for one who needed feeding, but could bear nothing heavy, rich yet gentle, and free of the troubles that dairy sometimes brought. It was among the most prized soft foods in the whole repertoire of sickroom cookery. We turn now to the restorative jellies, the strong comfort of the failing. For the very weak, the kitchen made jellies, and these were no light sweet things but strong, concentrated restoratives, made with great trouble for those in real need of building up. A calf's foot, or the shavings of hartshorn, the horn of the deer, was simmered for many long hours until the liquid, strained and left to cool, set into a trembling jelly, and this was enriched with wine, sugar, spice, and sometimes the strength of a fowl besides. Such jellies were reckoned among the most nourishing and reviving foods that could be given, easy to swallow, gentle on the stomach, and thought to carry a concentrated strength that helped rebuild a wasted body. A calf's foot jelly carried to an invalid was a small labor of hours and a real mark of care, made in the hope of coaxing a little strength back into someone dangerously low, and it kept its place as the very emblem of tender nursing food for centuries after the medieval kitchen itself had passed away. Let us turn now to the panada and the soft spoon, foods for the weakest of all. For the weakest, who could manage only the very softest food by the spoon, the kitchen-made panada and its kin, the gentlest step above a plain drink. Panada was bread boiled slowly in water or broth until it fell into a smooth, soft pulp, then seasoned lightly, sweetened or enriched with a little butter, an egg yolk, currants, or a whisper of spice according to what the sufferer could bear. It was warm, bland, soft, and nourishing, asking almost nothing of the stomach. And it was the food given to those who could take a little more than a drink, but far less than a meal. The young child through an illness, the old body failing slowly, the invalid on the first uncertain steps back toward solid food. These soft spoon foods, unglamorous and quickly made, were carried to more sick beds than any grand dish ever was, and the patient giving of them, a spoonful at a time, coaxing a weak body to take just a little more, was the very substance of household nursing. Let us turn now to the careful order of feeding a body back to health. If we stand back from all these broths and jellies and soft warm foods, we see that they formed a whole careful ladder by which the kitchen led a sick body step by step back toward health. At the very bottom, for the weakest, lay the thin drinks and the strong jellies, a little sweet wine, a spoon of cullis, a trembling jelly barley water for the fevered. A step up came the soft spoon foods, the panadas and the thin gruels. Above these the light broths, then the enriched broths and the caudles, then at last a little soft bread, a morsel of white meat, a small plain dish. As strength returned, the goodwife read her patient and chose the rung, never pressing solid food on a body not ready for it, never leaving a mending one too long on thin drink, moving up and down this ladder by the same careful judgment that governed everything she did. It was medicine of the most patient kind, spooned out warm through long nights and quiet days, and it healed more of the household sick than any bitter draught. And with the sickroom's soft food set gently aside, we may lift our eyes from the bedside to the beams above the kitchen, where the herbs hung drying that flavored and physicked all the rest. Let us turn now to the herbs at the rafters, to the bunches of drying leaves that hung from the beams above the fire. For the warm kitchen was where the year's medicine was made ready to keep. Look up in almost any medieval kitchen, and you would see them, bunches of herbs tied and hung from the beams, and the rafters above, swaying gently in the warm air that rose from the fire, drying slowly against the day they would be needed. This was no mere decoration, but one of the kitchen's most important labors of preservation. For a herb was only of use through the long year, if it had been gathered at its best and dried, and kept so that its virtue held. The warmth of the kitchen, dry and steady, and always moving with the rise of the fire's heat, made it the natural place for this drying, and so the room that cooked the food and brewed the ale was also the room where the household's whole store of physic herbs was cured and hung and kept. To pass beneath those swaying bunches was to walk under the very medicine chest of the house, hung up overhead in plain sight, filling the warm air with the mingled scent of a summer already gathered in. We turn now to the gathering and the drying and the care it asked. The herbs were gathered, as the old law insisted, at their proper time, most in the dry of a fine morning, once the dew had lifted, and many at the point of flowering when their virtue was thought fullest. And they were handled gently, for bruising and wetting were the enemies of good drying. Tied in small loose bunches, so the air could move through them, they were hung high in the warm dry kitchen, heads down, out of the direct heat and the smoke, and left until they were crisp and dry, but not scorched. Timing was everything, for a herb dried too slow in a damp place grew mouldy, and was spoiled, and one dried too fast or too hot lost its color and its strength. The goodwife judged all this by long habit, knowing when to gather, how thick to tie, where to hang, and when the leaves were dry enough to be taken down and stored, and a well-dried store of herbs, green still in color and strong in scent, was the mark of a careful and knowing house. Let us turn now to the storing and the keeping of the year's supply. Once dried, the herbs were taken down and stored against the year, and this too asked care. The dried leaves and flowers were stripped from their stalks and kept in cloth bags, in boxes and lidded crocks, or left in their bunches in a dry cupboard, each sort kept apart and known, labelled where the household could read and known by place and by scent where it could not. Kept dry and out of the light and air. A good store held its virtue through the winter and on until the new season's herbs came in to replace it, and the wise goodwife used up the old before the new and never let a year's medicine grow stale and wasted on the shelf. Roots were kept too, dug and dried and stored in sand or hung up, and seeds saved in little parcels, so that between the hanging bunches, the boxes of leaves, the parcels of seed, and the crocks of root, the kitchen held the whole year's physic garden preserved and waiting, gathered in its season and doled out through all the seasons that followed. We turn now to the goodwife's standing store, and the herbs no kitchen was without. Certain herbs were so useful and so constantly needed that scarcely a kitchen was without them hanging overhead, and these made up the goodwife's standing store. Sage for the mouth, the throat, and the strengthening of the head. Thyme and hyssop and marjoram for the chest and the cough. Mint and fennel and dill for the stomach and the wind. Chamomile for a fretful child and an aching belly. And to make the fomentations and the soothing washes. Elderflower, dried from the summer hedge, for fevers and the eyes. Rosemary for the head and the memory and for sweetening the air. Wormwood, bitter, for the stomach and against the worm and the muth. Batony, that old cure, all for the head and 100 troubles besides. Between a dozen or two such trusted herbs, kept dried and ready overhead, the Goodwife had at hand the answer to the great run of ordinary ills, the coughs, the chills, the aching heads and griping bellies, the fevers and the sleepless nights, that made up the common round of a household sickness. Let us turn now to the strewing herbs, the sweet leaves scattered on the floor. Not all the herbs that came into the kitchen went into the pot or the medicine cup, for some were kept simply to sweeten the air and cleanse the room, strewn fresh across the floor among the rushes. Meadowsweet, whose very name in the old form meant the herb strewn about, was loved above all for this, its cut stems giving off a sweet almond scent when trodden, and lavender, sweet flag, tansy, chamomile, and many another were scattered likewise. This was more than a matter of pleasant smell, for the sweet herbs underfoot were believed to freshen a close room, to drive off fleas and moths and biting things, and to guard against the bad air that was thought to carry sickness, so that the strewing of a floor with sweet herbs was reckoned a small act of physic as much as of housekeeping. In the sickroom especially the floor was kept strewn, and the air kept sweet, and the scent of trodden meadowsweet and lavender rising in a warm room was itself felt to be healing, a gentle freshness against the staleness that gathered where illness lay. We turn now to the sweet bags and the guarding of the stores. The same sweet herbs that freshened the floor were dried and sewn into little bags to sweeten and guard the household's linen and clothes, and this too joined the pleasant to the practical. Bags of dried lavender, southernwood, wormwood, and rosemary were laid among the folded linen in the press and the chest, their scent keeping the cloth sweet, and more to the point, driving off the moths whose grubs would otherwise ruin a household's precious woolens. Southernwood, whose old name lads love we met in another evening, was prized especially against the moth, and wormwood likewise, so bitter that no creeping thing would touch what it lay among. These small fragrant bags, tucked among the stores and renewed each year from the drying bunches overhead, were a quiet defense of the household's goods, and they show once more how the herbs of the kitchen reached into every corner of the house's keeping, sweetening the air, guarding the linen, flavoring the pot, and healing the sick, all from the same bunches hung to dry above the fire. Let us turn now, to close this part of our evening, to the herb-hung kitchen as the poor household's still-room. In the great house there was a room apart for all this, the still-room, cool and orderly, where the lady and her maids distilled their waters and made their conserves and kept their physic in labelled order, and we have visited such rooms on other evenings. But the ordinary household had no such room, and for it the warm kitchen was the still room, the beams overhead its drying loft, the shelf by the fire its dispensary, the same pots and the same fire serving the physic and the supper alike. The herbs hung to dry above the humble hearth were that house's whole apothecary, gathered by the Goodwife herself, cured in the warmth of her own fire, stored in her own crocks, and doled out by her own hand, as the year's illnesses came and went. And when we picture that low warm room at night, the fire banked, the bunches of dried herbs swaying faintly in the rising heat, their mingled scent filling the dark, we are picturing the truest form of the medieval pharmacy, not a shop of jars nor a walled physic garden, but a kitchen with a year of gathered medicine hanging quietly from its beams. And with that scent about us, we may turn to the plain tools ranged below, the mortar and the small fire by which those hanging herbs were made into medicine. Let us turn now to the mortar and the small fire, to the plain tools of the kitchen that were also the tools of the pharmacy, for the same hands and the same instruments made both the supper and the medicine. Ranged about the medieval kitchen stood the tools of its work, and there was scarcely one among them that did not serve the making of medicine as readily as the making of food. The mortar that pounded the spice pounded the herb, the knife that chopped the onion shredded the physic leaf. The strainer that cleared the broth strained the decoction. The little pot that warmed the sauce steeped the remedy. There was no separate set of instruments kept apart for healing, for in this kitchen healing was simply one more of the things the ordinary tools were used for, and the goodwife moved from cooking to physic and back again without ever changing her implements, or, very often, her place at the fire. To understand the kitchen as a pharmacy, it helps to look at these plain tools once more and see, in each familiar object, the double life it led. We turn now to the mortar and pestle, the great tool of both kitchen and physic. If any one tool stood at the meeting of cookery and medicine, it was the mortar and its pestle, and no well-found kitchen was without one. In it the goodwife pounded her peppercorns and her dried spices to powder, ground her mustard seed, bruised her herbs, mashed her cooked pulses smooth, and pounded the meat for a cullis. And in the very same vessel she broke and blended the ingredients of her remedies, crushing dried leaves to powder, working herbs into a paste, pounding roots and seeds for a medicine. Mortars were made of hard stone, of brass and bronze, or of close, grained wood, the heavy standing ones for hard daily work, and the steady thud of the pestle was one of the constant sounds of the kitchen. So bound was this tool to the making of medicine that the mortar and pestle became, in time, the very sign of the apothecary's trade, hung above his door, and yet it had lived in the ordinary kitchen all along, grinding the household's spice and the household's physic with the same patient turning of the same strong arm. Let us turn now to the strainers and the cloths by which the rough was made smooth. Much of both cookery and physic lay in the straining, the separating of the smooth from the coarse, and the kitchen kept its sieves, its colanders, and above all its straining cloths for exactly this. A decoction of herbs simmered in water had to be strained clear of the spent leaves before it could be given, a syrup cleared of its dregs, a cullis or an almond milk passed through a cloth until it ran smooth, and the same fine woven straining cloth that clarified a broth or a jelly clarified the medicine too. The tammy cloth and the linen strainer, wrung and pressed to force the last of the goodness through, were as much tools of the medicine making as of the kitchen, and a store of clean straining cloths was among the goodwife's needful things. It is a small and homely detail, the wringing of a herbal brew through a cloth into a waiting bowl, and yet without that straining half the household's remedies could not have been given at all, and the cloth that did it hung by the same hook as the one that strained the supper. We turn now to the little pots of the small fire, the pipkin and the posnet. Not all cooking was done in the great pot over the roaring fire, for much of the kitchen's finer and gentler work, and nearly all its medicine making, was done in small vessels at a small, quiet heat. The pipkin, a little earthenware pot with a handle, and often 3 small feet, to stand it among the embers, and the posnet, its metal cousin, were made for exactly this: the warming and slow simmering of small quantities, a single serving of gruel, a few spoonfuls of a syrup, a little pot of herbs set to steep. The chafing dish, a small vessel of glowing charcoal, gave a gentle steady heat away from the fierce main fire, perfect for the careful warming of a caudle that must not curdle, or a medicine that must not boil too hard. These small vessels and gentle heats were the true workshop of kitchen physic, for a remedy was most often a small thing, made for one person for one trouble, and it was in the pipkin at the edge of the fire, not the great cauldron above it, that most of the household's medicine was quietly made. Let us turn now to the still at the hearth, and the waters drawn from herb and flower. Some kitchens, and nearly all the grander ones, kept a still, and with it the household drew the fragrant waters and strong spirits that were among the most prized of its home, made physic. A simple still, an alembic or limbec of metal or of earthenware and glass, set over a gentle fire with a vessel of cold water to catch and cool the rising vapor, would draw from a mash of flowers and herbs a clear fragrant distilled water. Rosewater, the most beloved of all, was made so, and mint water, elderflower water, and the waters of a dozen other herbs, each kept for its own use, to flavor a dish, to freshen a sickroom, to bathe a sore eye, or to carry a medicine gently. Stronger stilling gave the aqua vita, the water of life, the fiery distilled spirit that was reckoned a great cordial and a warming restorative, given in small careful drops to revive the failing and the faint. This distilling was the most delicate and skilled of the kitchen's arts, half cookery and half something closer to the alchemist's craft. And the fragrant waters it drew off were treasured on the shelf beside the honey and the spice. We turn now to the measuring and to a kitchen that worked without scales. For all this making of food and physic, the medieval kitchen worked with almost none of the exact measuring a later age would think needful, and the goodwife measured instead by eye, by hand, and by long habit. A handful of this, a good pinch of that, an eggshell of one thing, a walnut of another, as much as will lie on a penny, enough to cover the palm. These were the measures of the kitchen and of its physic alike, passed down in the very words of the old receipts. Where finer weighing was needed, for a costly spice or a stronger drug, a small balance might be used. But for the common run of cooking and remedy, making the measure was the goodwife's own trained judgment, her hand that knew the weight of a right pinch of salt or a right dose of a dried herb from 10,000 repetitions. This unweighed, unwritten skill was the very heart of her competence, and it was exactly the kind of knowledge that passed only by doing, from a mother's hand to a daughter's, never quite to be caught in any book, however carefully the receipts were later written down. Let us turn now to the keeping and the passing down of these tools, because the tools of the kitchen were also the tools of the household's medicine. They were valued and kept and handed down with care. A good brass mortar, a fine set of pans, a treasured still. These were things of real worth, listed in wills and left carefully to a daughter along with the knowledge of their use, so that the instrument and the skill passed down together. A young woman coming into her own kitchen brought with her, if she was fortunate, some of her mother's own vessels, and with them the memory of her mother's hand at the mortar and the pipkin, the two inheritances scarcely separable. In this the plain iron and brass and earthenware of the kitchen carried something of the household's continuity. The same worn pestle grinding the physic for grandmother, mother, and daughter in turn. The same little pipkin warming 3 generations of gruel and syrup at the edge of the same kind of fire. And, with these plain, treasured tools ranged in the mind, we may turn from the making of the medicine to the judging of it, to the goodwife's own art of knowing when a food became a physic. Let us turn now to sickroom cookery and the goodwife's judgment, to the deepest art of the whole kitchen, the knowing of when a food ceased to be mere food and became a medicine. We come now to the very heart of everything we have spoken of tonight, which is not any single herb or dish, but a way of seeing, the understanding, held by the goodwife as by the physician, that food and medicine were not 2 things, but one continuous thing, and that the whole art lay in matching what was eaten to the body that ate it. A food that nourished a well body might harm a sick one. A dish that suited a hot, fevered patient would be wrong for a cold and shivering one. The same warm, spiced cup that comforted a chill would inflame a fever. To know these matchings, and to choose for each sufferer the food that would help and not harm, was the goodwife's subtlest skill, and it was in this judging, far more than in any recipe, that she practiced the true physic of the kitchen. We turn now to the doctrine of the qualities, and the matching of food to illness. The whole of this judging rested on the old understanding of the 4 qualities, the hot, the cold, the moist, and the dry, which were held to run through every food and every body and every illness alike. A sickness was understood as an excess of one quality, a fever as too much heat, a chill and a rheum as too much cold and damp, and the cure was to be sought in its contrary, cooling foods for the hot disease, warming foods for the cold one, drying foods for the too moist, moistening for the too dry. So for the fevered the kitchen made the cooling things, barley water, whey, the juices of sharp cooling fruits, thin and moist and cool. For the chilled and the phlegmatic it made the warming things, the spiced oil, the pungent broth, the ginger and the pepper. Every food had its own nature in this scheme, and the goodwife carried a whole map of it in her head, choosing from her stores not at random, but by a reasoning as old as the physicians of Greece, setting the contrary quality against the disease to bring the body back toward its balance. Let us turn now to the matching of food to the person, and not the illness alone. It was not the illness alone that the goodwife weighed, but the person, for the old understanding held that every individual had their own balance of the qualities, their own complexion, differing by age, by sex, by season, and by nature. The very young and the very old, the hot-blooded and the cold, the choleric and the melancholy. Each was thought to need a somewhat different diet to keep them in their own right balance, and what was wholesome for a hearty, laboring man might be too strong and heating for a frail old woman or a delicate child. So the good wife fed each member of the household with half an eye to their nature. The growing child, the ancient grandparent, the woman with child, the man worn down by toil, giving to each the foods thought to suit their years and their constitution. This was regimen, the ordering of the daily life, and above all the daily food, to keep each body in health. And it was reckoned by the physicians of the age the first and best of all medicine, the keeping of health being ever wiser than the mending of sickness. We turn now to the diet through an illness, and the careful road back. When sickness did come, the Goodwife governed the sufferer's food through the whole course of it, and this governing was itself a large part of the cure. At the height of a fever, when the body could take little and was thought to be laboring to throw off the disease, she gave only the thinnest and coolest things, barley water and whey and a little thin broth, and let the body fast of heavier food, for to force strong meat on a body at its crisis was held to feed the disease as much as the patient. Then, as the fever broke and the sufferer began to mend, she led them slowly back up the ladder we spoke of earlier, from thin drinks to soft spoon, foods to light broths, to a little white meat and soft bread, watching always that she did not press solid food too soon on a stomach not ready for it. This careful road back, neither starving the mending body nor overburdening it, was one of the Goodwife's finest judgments, and a recovery well managed at the kitchen fire owed as much to her patient ordering of the diet as to any medicine the sufferer ever swallowed. We turn now to the tempting of a failing appetite, the gentlest of all the Goodwife's skills. There was a particular art the sickroom asked of the kitchen that went beyond the mere choosing of the right food, and that was the coaxing of a body that had no wish to eat at all, to take a little nourishment despite itself. A sick person often lost all desire for food, and yet without some little nourishment they could not mend, and so the Goodwife bent her skill to tempting them, offering small amounts, prettily and warmly served, of the most pleasant and easily taken things, a few spoonfuls of a clear rich broth, a little pale jelly, a soft coddled egg, a morsel of white meat of a fowl, a sweet spiced posset. She gave little and often rather than much at once, for a small quantity taken and kept down did more good than a large one refused or brought up again. And she watched for the small returning flickers of appetite, the particular thing a convalescent might fancy, and made it gladly. This patient tempting, the warming of one more little cup, the carrying of one more small dish to a bedside in the hope that this time a few mouthfuls might be taken, was among the tenderest and most wearing of all the labours of nursing, and it belonged wholly to the kitchen and to the woman who ruled it. Let us turn now to the moment food became physic, the quiet decision at the heart of it all. Somewhere in all this lay a moment we have circled all evening, the moment when, in the Goodwife's own mind, a food stopped being supper and became medicine. It was rarely a dramatic moment, and never a written one. It was the instant she decided that this pottage should have more of the pungent herb, because a cold was going round, that this isle should be warmed and spiced, because the child had taken a chill, that this broth should be strained finer and given by the spoon, because the old man could no longer take his meat, that the fever in the far bed called now for barley water, and not for the family's supper at all. In that small unspoken decision, made 100 times through every illness and repeated across a whole life of tending her household, lay the entire truth of the kitchen as a pharmacy. There was no line drawn on any shelf between the food and the medicine, because the line was drawn again and again in the Goodwife's own judging mind. At the moment she chose to make a thing for its good upon the body, rather than merely for the filling of the belly. Let us turn now, to close this part of our evening, to the physician's respect for the kitchen's art. It would be easy to think of all this as the poor relation of true medicine, the makeshift of those too humble or too far from a physician to have anything better. But that is not how the learned physicians of the age themselves saw it. The best of them held the ordering of diet to be the very foundation of their whole art, wrote long and careful books upon which foods suited which conditions, and prescribed, as often as any drug, exactly the broths and gruels, and cooling drinks and warming cordials that the Goodwife made at her fire. The famous verses of the school of Salerno, copied across all of Europe, were in large part a guide to eating and living well, and the physician at the grand bedside and the Goodwife at the humble one were, in their care of the sick body's food, practicing the same art at different stations. The kitchen was not a lesser pharmacy, but the first one, the place where most people, most of the time, were kept in health or nursed through sickness, and the Goodwife who ruled it was, in the truest and oldest sense of the word, a physician of the household. And with that thought to rest on, we may turn to the last of our stations, the turning of the kitchen's year and the worn book by the candle, as our evening draws slowly toward its close. Let us turn now to the kitchen through the turning year, for the making of the household's medicine followed the seasons as closely as the growing of its food, and each part of the year had its own laying by. Everything we have walked among tonight, the dried herbs at the rafters, the salted meat, the crocks of fat and honey and vinegar, the pickles and the conserves, came into being at its own proper season, for the kitchen was a place of foresight, always working to lay by against a time of need not yet arrived. The medicine of winter was gathered in summer. The salves for the coming cold weather were made when the herbs bloomed and the beasts were killed. The whole year turned, in the Goodwife's mind, as one long unhurried labor of provision, each season bringing its own harvest to be caught at its height and preserved before it passed, so that the shelves and beams and crocks of the kitchen held, at any moment, the gathered gifts of all the seasons that had gone before. To follow that turning year is to see the kitchen, pharmacy not as a still storeroom but as a living thing, filling and emptying with the wheel of the seasons. We turn now to the spring and the cleansing of the year's first green. Spring came to the winter, wary household as a welcome medicine in itself, for after the long months of salted meat and dried and stored food the body was thought to be dull, clogged, and in need of clearing, and the first fresh green things of the year were seized upon as the cure. The young nettle tops, the watercress from the running stream, the wild garlic of the woods, the first sprouting worts, and the bitter cleansing herbs, all were gathered eagerly and cooked into the pot as a freshening and a cleansing of the blood after the barren season. It was the time, too, when the earliest flowers were caught for physic, the primrose and the violet, the cowslip for its quieting virtue, and when the household began again to make its fresh green medicines after the dried stores of winter. Spring was thus a season of renewal for the kitchen, pharmacy, as much as for the fields. The Goodwife turning gladly from her dwindling winter crocks to the living green of the returning year. Let us turn now to the summer, the great season of gathering and making. Summer was the busiest season of all for the household's physic, for it was then that the herbs stood at their fullest strength, and the whole year's store of dried medicine had to be gathered and made. Through the long warm days the Goodwife, gathered and dried her herbs, bunch after bunch hung up to cure in the warm kitchen, and she made her conserves and her syrups, while the flowers and the early fruit were at their best, pounding rose petals with sugar into a conserve, boiling fruit and honey into keeping syrups, distilling her fragrant waters while the roses and the mint were in bloom. Midsummer, tied to the feast of St. John, was held the very peak of the herb gatherer's year, when certain herbs were reckoned strongest of all. The bees gave their honey to be taken and stored, the hives yielding up the year's sweetness, and the wax for the salves and the candles. It was a season of heat and hard labor and sweet smells, the kitchen crowded with the making and the drying, all of it racing to catch the summer's plenty and fix it in crock and bag and bottle before it faded. We turn now to the autumn, the season of the harvest home and the laying in. Autumn was the season of gathering in and of laying down against the winter, and no season filled the kitchen stores more heavily. The grain was harvested and the roots lifted, the apples and pears gathered and laid in store, the last of the herbs and the seeds saved and dried. Then came the great labor of the slaughter, when the beasts that could not be fed through the winter were killed, and the kitchen turned to the salting of the meat, the rendering of the fat into its crocks, the making of the puddings and the preserved joints that would feed the family through the cold. Vinegars were made and the pickles laid down, the sharp preserved things sealed in their jars, and the cider and the last of the year's brewing set by. It was a season of plenty and of hard, driving work, the whole household bent to the task of filling every crock and barrel and loft, for what was not laid by now would not be had at all in the barren months to come. When it was done, the kitchen stood full, its beams hung, its shelves crowded, its cellar stocked, ready to face the winter it knew was coming. Let us turn now to the winter and the living off the year's gathered stores. Winter was the season the whole year had prepared for, the time when nothing grew and the household lived on what it had laid by. And now the wisdom of all that gathering was proved. From the salted meat and the dried peas came the winter pottage, from the crocks the honey and the fat, from the beams the dried herbs for the coughs and chills that the cold weather surely brought, from the store the onions and garlic for the winter's colds, from the cellar the roots and apples. The winter was the great season of the household's sickness, the coughs and the chest colds, the aching chilled joints, the fevers of the dark cold months, and it was met, meal by meal and remedy by remedy, out of the stores that the summer and autumn had filled, the warm spice stall, the onion syrup, the goose grace for the chest, the dried herbs steeped for the cough. All of these were the summer's foresight answering the winter's need. And through it all the fire burned on, warming the room, heating the water, steeping the herbs, the one thing that did not have to be laid by, because it was never let go out. We turn now to the foresight beneath it all, the working for a need not yet come. There is something worth pausing on in this turning year, which is the deep foresight it asked of the Goodwife, the constant working now for a trouble that lay months ahead. When she dried her herbs in the summer sun, she was thinking of the coughs of the coming winter. When she rendered her fat at the autumn slaughter, she was making the salves and the chest rubs for cold weather not yet arrived. When she laid down her vinegars and pickles, she was providing against the barren months. and the scurvy of a diet grown stale. Nothing of the household's medicine was made in the moment of need, for by then it would be too late, the herb long since past, the beast long since gone. It was all made ahead, in its season, and kept so that the shelf held the answer before the question was asked. This quiet, patient foresight, the ordering of a whole year's labor toward troubles that had not yet come, was among the deepest of the Goodwife's skills, and it is perhaps the truest mark of the kitchen as a real and serious pharmacy, stocked always in advance against the ills it knew the turning year would bring. Let us turn now, to close, to the year come round again to its quiet centre. So the year turned, spring to summer, to autumn to winter, and round to spring again, and through all its turning the kitchen filled and emptied, and filled once more, its stores rising and falling with the seasons like a slow tide. And at the centre of all that turning stood the one constant thing, the fire, and beside it the Goodwife, gathering, making, laying by, doling out, reading the year, and the weather and the health of her household, and providing always a little ahead of the need. It is a deeply steadying thing to contemplate at this hour, this long, slow wheel of provision, the summer's gathering answering the winter's cold, the whole of it turning quietly year upon year, generation upon generation, around the steady centre of the hearth. And with that wheel turning gently in the mind, we may come at last to the final station of our evening, the worn book kept by the fire, where the whole of this knowledge was written down. Let us turn now to the receipt book by the candle, to the worn and precious household book, in which the cookery and the cure of the kitchen were written together on the same page. For this book was the memory of everything we have walked among tonight. In many a household, especially as the centuries passed and more women came to read and write, there was kept a book, handwritten and much used, into which were set down the household's recipes and remedies together, and this was the receipt book. The old word receipt meant simply a thing received, a formula taken down to be kept, and it covered without distinction a recipe for a cake and a recipe for a cordial, for in this book, as in the kitchen it served, no line was drawn between the two. A page might hold, one above the other, the making of a fine pie and the making of a salve for burns, a recipe for a spiced wine, and a receipt for a water against the fever. The food and the physic written in the same hand, kept in the same book, because to the woman who kept it they were simply the two halves of the one art of keeping a household well. We turn now to how the book grew, hand by hand and year by year. A receipt book was rarely written all at once, but grew slowly across many years and often across many lives, added to hand by hand as new recipes and remedies were learned. A woman began her book, perhaps, with receipts copied from her mother's own, and through her life she added to it. A good remedy learned from a neighbor, a recipe traded with a friend, a cordial that had served the family well in a hard winter, each set down in her own hand as it was proved. Beside many an entry stood a few words of testimony that this remedy had been tried and had answered, sometimes in the old Latin phrase probatum est. It is proven, the household's own quiet mark of what had truly worked. So the book became, over time, a tested and trusted store of the family's whole practical knowledge, not a thing copied idly from print, but a living record of what this household had actually found to serve, in the kitchen and in the sickroom alike. Let us turn now to the book as a woman's inheritance, passed mother to daughter. The receipt book was, above almost anything else in the house, a woman's possession and a woman's inheritance, passed down from mother to daughter, along with the knowledge it held. To a young woman setting up her own household, it was a treasure beyond price, the gathered wisdom of her mother and her grandmother made portable and permanent, the answers to 100 questions she had not yet thought to ask, set down ready against the day she would need them. She would add to it in her turn and pass it on again, so that a well-kept book might carry the hands of 3 or 4 generations of women, the older entries faded and the newer crisp. A whole line of good wives speaking down the years to the one who now held the pen. These books were named in wills and left with care, and a good few of them survive still, their pages stained with the work of the kitchens they served, and they give us one of our clearest windows into exactly the world we have walked through tonight, the world in which food and medicine were one. We turn now to the trading of receipts, the wide, quiet network of women's knowledge. No household's book was an island, for receipts were traded busily among women, copied from friends and kin, and passed from hand to hand across a whole countryside and beyond, so that a single good remedy might spread through dozens of books and dozens of kitchens. A receipt was often kept under the name of the woman it had come from. My lady this one's water for the eyes, my cousin that one's receipt for a cough, and these names, preserved in the books, trace the quiet lines of a whole network of women exchanging their knowledge. Learned neighbor from neighbor and generation from generation, entirely outside the world of the universities and the physicians that was closed to them. It was a great collaborative store of practical medicine, held and grown and shared by women, and the receipt book by the fire was each household's own copy of it, its particular gathering from that wide and generous common stock. Let us turn now to the day this knowledge came to be printed and gathered up for all. For most of the medieval centuries this knowledge lived only in memory and in the handwritten book, but there came a time, as printing spread, when it began to be gathered up and set down in print for all to buy, and the household books of cookery and physic became some of the most popular printed works there were. Whole volumes appeared addressed to the housewife, promising to teach her the ordering of her kitchen, her dairy, her brewing, and her physic all together, and they took it entirely for granted, exactly as this whole evening has, that the mistress of a house was the maker of its medicine as much as of its meals, and gave her the recipes for both side by side. These printed books did not invent the knowledge they held. They gathered up what the handwritten books and the memories of countless good wives had carried all along, and fixed it in print, and in doing so they preserved for us a great part of what we have spoken of tonight, the plain, tested, everyday physic of the kitchen, written down at last before it could be forgotten. Let us turn now close to the book set down and the candle burning low. And so we come to the end of our stations, with the worn book closed upon the table by the guttering candle, holding within its stained and crowded pages the whole of the knowledge we have wandered through this evening, the herbs and the spices, the honey and the vinegar, the broths and the possets, the salves and the syrups, the careful judging of when a supper became a medicine. It is a fitting place to end this humble book by the fire, for in it the whole scattered wisdom of the kitchen was drawn together into one, the memory of 100 remedies and 1,000 small acts of care, written down by one patient hand after another so that it should not be lost. The candle burns low beside it now. The fire has settled to its embers, and the long, warm, unhurried night in the kitchen draws gently toward its close. We have wandered a very long way tonight, and always within the 4 warm walls of a single room. We began at the fire, the beating heart of the house, and moved from there to the everlasting pot, and then along the shelves and stores that lined the walls, the salt and the precious spice, the honey crock and the vinegar jug, the cool dairy and the bread oven, the crocks of fat and the ropes of onions and garlic. We watched the brewing of the all, and the making of the caudles and possets, and the strengthening broths for the sick. And we looked up at the herbs, drying at the rafters, and down at the plain tools that made them into medicine. We came to the Goodwife's own art, her quiet judging of when a food became a physic, and we followed the kitchen through its turning year of laying by, and we ended at the worn book by the candle where all of it was written down. And through the whole of it ran one gentle truth, that in the medieval home the kitchen was the pharmacy, and the Goodwife at its fire was the household's first physician, healing her family day after day with nothing more than the plain warm things ready to her hand. There is nothing left to remember, and nothing at all left to do. The pot is lifted off and scoured and hung. The book is closed. The herbs sway quietly in the last warmth rising from the coals, and the whole busy day of the kitchen has come to its rest. If your eyes have closed somewhere along the way, that was always exactly the point of the evening, and there is nothing whatever that you have missed. Sleep well. The quiet apothecary will be back soon with another quiet chapter. Let the warmth of the hearth hold you now, and let every thought grow soft and slow and far away. The fire is banked, the kitchen is still, and there is nothing before you now but the long, gentle dark, and rest, and morning a long way off.